Welcome back, guys. You have been killing it with the support lately, and I appreciate every bit of it. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and let's get right into the video.
There are few reliable accounts of what the galaxy truly became once the great warp storm rose and ate the stars. What records we possess are a patchwork of legionary testimony, remembrance of fragments, recovered Vox logs, and Mechanicum data ghosts, each one warped by fear, ignorance, or deliberate design. In that age, truth itself became a kind of heresy, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the chronicles that deal with Primarchs. Some speak of Lionel Johnson as the noble hunter, the last true knight in an age of monsters. Others paint him as a cold thing of iron and calculation, a war spirit wearing the shape of a man who measured lives the way a scrivener measured ink. Between these extremes, between devotion and hatred, lies something close to reality, but it is buried in the same ash as everything else the heresy touched. What is certain is this. After the Night Haunter escaped the dungeons of the Invincible Reason, after his pale shadow slipped through the flagship's veins and left a trail of broken lives and dead angels in its wake, the Lion changed. He had always been distant, always a creature of the hunt, but in the days that followed Kurz's escape and the revelation of the wider betrayal, the Primarch of the First Legion narrowed, like a blade being honed. Every account from those years agrees on one point. He was hunting a single soul, and he was willing to burn entire worlds to mark the trail. The strategium of the flagship was a vault of cold light and colder purpose. Hologlobes hung from the high darkness like wounded suns, bleeding threads of augur data and astropathic cipher into the air. Legionaries and mortal officers moved between them in careful patterns, like insects crawling across the bones of some immense beast. The void beyond the armored viewports was gone, swallowed by a haze of crimson and bruise black, the ruin storm pressing against the hull with lunatic malice. Lightning walked across that unnatural sky without end. The warp growled and whispered and clawed at reality. The fleet endured within that storm as a spear of iron pushed through a wound. Lionel Johnson stood at the heart of the Strategium Deus, bareheaded, armor unhelmed, so that every soul present was forced to look upon his human face and remember that he was not a machine. For many, that made him more terrible, not less. The light of the projectors painted his features in shifting pallor, carving hollows beneath his eyes and along the line of his jaw. His gaze was fixed upon one hollow globe in particular, where a ghost of Ultramar hung in the dark. He remembered Macragga. He remembered the dead of the 13th Legion, laid out in their own fortress, their blood frozen in dark sheets on marble floors. He remembered Kurz's laughter echoing down the great halls, the Night Haunter's broken voice whispering that this was what came of building empires on lies. He remembered the humiliation of a brother who had torn free of his chains, danced through the arteries of the Invincible Reason, and escaped into the madness beyond, leaving only corpses and prophecy behind. I should have ended him on Sagualsa, the Lion thought, as he had thought 1,000 times already. I should have ended him on Nostramo. I should have ended him the first time I saw what he would become. Regret had no place in him. He scoured it away whenever it surfaced. But something like obsession had taken its place. In an age where loyal and traitor fleets alike went blind in the ruin storm and stumbled through the warp like drunken beasts, the Lion charted a different kind of course. His was a vector drawn not on star charts, but on the paths of murder left in Kurz's wake. On the lower tier of the dais, Farith Redloss waited with the still patience of a grave marker. The commander of the Dreadwing stood in heavy, scarred warplate, the dark green of the Legion almost black beneath the hooded glare of lumen strips. His helm was locked, in place, concealing the ruined terrain of his face, and his gauntleted hands rested on the haft of his axe as if even here, in the sanctity of the Strategium, he anticipated the need to kill. Around him, Other officers of the First Legion stood at respectful attention. Veterans of 100 compliances, masters of wings and orders, the kind of men lesser armies would have crowned as lords in their own right. Here, they were simply tools, waiting to be directed by the one will that mattered. "Magnify the trailing vector," the Lion said. The words were quiet, barely above a murmur, but they carried to every ear in the chamber. Servo skulls hanging in the gloom tilted their skeletal faces, vox emitters whispering the order in Binharic to the consoles below. A robed adept of the fleet, fingers replaced with slender augmetic needles, bent his head in a jerking bow and fed new commands into the hollow projectors. The projection of Ultramar and its scattered protectorates warped and shrank. The ruin storm surged across it as a roiling red veil, much of the once ordered realm lost behind curtains of empiric static and twisted gravity. Threads of possible routes, calculated by engines that had long ago ceased to be entirely sane, flickered into and out of existence. Among those dying skeins of light, a thin smear burned a little brighter than the rest, a wound of pale energy cutting through the haze. "There," Redlos said. Even through his helmvox, his voice carried the roughness of old scars. Again. Zepath. The name whispered through the strategium, carried on vox relays and the murmurs of those officers who recognized it from earlier reports. A minor world once, a fortified way station near the edge of Ultramar's influence, hardly a jewel in the crown of Gilliman's realm. In any sane age, it would have remained a footnote in gazetters and administratum charts. In the age of the Shadow Crusade, nothing remained minor for long. "Confirmation?" the Lion asked. "Fragmentary," replied one of the mortal fleet officers, a gaunt man in a dark coat cut with the double-wing sigil of the First. The last astropathic bursts from Zepath speak of Word-Bearer and World-Eater incursions, mass sacrifice, system-wide devastation, then silence. The Lion watched the hollow globe for a long heartbeat. The ruin storm ate the edges of the projection, nibbling at the outlines of worlds and stations, red and black, static and lightning. The echo trail that led towards Zepath pulsed, fading with every moment. The Word-Bearers and World-Eaters, Lorgar's priests and Angron's butchers, yoked together in mad devotion to the same hidden masters. They had carved their way through Ultramar, like a ritual knife through a living body, turning agri-worlds into altars, hive cities into pyramids of skulls, leaving only cinders and scripture in their wake. Where they walked, civilization died screaming. The Shadow Crusade, they called it. A campaign of fire and faith. A covenant written in murder. In the recovered Vox fragments from worlds that met them first, you can still hear the madness. Word-bearer sermons transmitted over stolen astropathic channels, intoning that only in death could the false empire be purified. World-Eater Vox howls, nothing but rage and bloodlust amplified until they drowned out the dying pleas of civilians. Together, they preached a doctrine written in 1 billion corpses, a gospel whose only sacraments were pain and void cold. The Lion knew all of this. He had read the reports, weighed the tally of the dead, and found it meaningless, save for one detail. Kurz's shadow walked somewhere along the same paths. Farith Redlos shifted slightly, the movement minute, but enough to chime the plates of his warplate together. "Zepath has fallen, my lord," he said. "By all accounts, it is a dead world dressed in the flesh of the living. The trail may not lead beyond it. Or it may," the Lion replied. His eyes never left the hollow globe. "Kurz follows the scent of fear. He delights in worlds already broken. If the traitor legions have turned Zepath into an altar to their new gods, the Night Haunter may yet have walked there to hear their prayers." Redlos bowed his head in acknowledgement. He understood as well as any that the Lion's reasoning did not need to be flawless. It only needed to point toward a place where enemies had gathered in great number. For the Dreadwing, that was enough. "Prepare an annihilation operation," the Primarch said. The words dropped into the silence like shells into a magazine. On the lower decks, servitors stirred as kill order codes rippled through cogitator banks. In the vaults deep beneath the ship's more human spaces, lock sigils kindled to life along rows of black iron doors. The Dreadwing, whose duty it was to carry the most abominable weapons the Imperium had ever forged, raised their heads like hounds, scenting blood. "Eschaton status?" Redloss asked, his voice as calm as if requesting a minor change of formation. "At your discretion," the Lion answered. "If Zepeth is beyond recall, it will serve as an example. If it is not, we will decide how much of it should continue to exist." He did not speak of saving civilians. He did not think in those terms, not here, not now. The people of Zepeth, whatever number of them remained, had already been subjected to horrors beyond imagination. The word-bearers did not merely conquer. They catechized with knife and brand, reshaping souls to fit the mouths of their new gods. The World-Eaters left nothing at all. A man who survived both was no longer the same man. A world that endured their passing was no longer the same world. He would not come as a savior, as some shining knight upon a green world. He would come as a blade, as a judge, as the end. If Kurz is there, he thought, then the dead of Macgregor will have their echo. If he is not, then I will at least have killed those who chose to stand alongside his like. One of the data shrines hissed, crackling with fresh input. An astropathic relay, decoded and rendered as sound, bled into the strategium. For a moment, the voices of the crew fell silent, as if even they understood that they were hearing something that had already claimed the lives of millions. "Brothers," a voice crooned in High Gothic, rich and sonorous, the accent off in some indefinable way that spoke of long practice in lies. "Brothers of flesh and bone, rejoice. The false realm of Ultramar burns. The god who was bound in silence has been named, and his name is written in fire across the heavens. The cities of Zepath have offered up their children, their warriors, their rulers, and the ashes of their dead. They have made themselves a chalice. Now we pour forth their blood." In the background of the transmission, another sound rose and fell, chain weapons roaring, men screaming, the ragged, inhuman crashing of World-Eater war cries. The sermon did not pause for them. "This is the first book of our new scripture," the word-bearer continued. "Page upon page, world upon world, we inscribe the true faith with 1,000,000,000 skulls. Each broken world is a verse, each dying cry is a word, until only devotion remains, until only blood remains, until only the laughter of the gods remains." The recording cut off in a rush of static. Vox wards flared, choking the last whispers of alien tongues. The hollow globe dimmed, its light fading as if in disgust. "Shadow Crusade traffic," one of the mortal adepts said, unnecessarily. His hands shook on the edge of his console. "Recovered from a derelict relay station at the edge of Ultramar. It matches signals traced toward Zepath." The Lion nodded once, almost absently. That sermon, or one like it, could have come from any of a dozen burning worlds. The word-bearers liked to repeat themselves. They were priests in love with the sound of their own voices. It did not matter. What mattered was the vector. He turned at last from the hollow globe and looked down upon the officers gathered before him. The full weight of his gaze settled on Redloss, then moved outward, taking in masters of companies, captains of escorts, even the mortal admirals who commanded the fleet's heavier elements. "Signal the fleet," he said. "Advise all formations to close on the Zepath system. This is a priority hunt. We pursue at once." The scale of the force that answered his will would have broken the spine of most sectors. Dozens of capital ships, strike cruisers, and grand cruisers, bearing the markings of the First Legion and those loyalist chapters that still fought alongside them in that broken age. hundreds upon hundreds of escorts, destroyers and frigates, each one a spear of armored steel and plasma, raging through the storm. Behind the blades came the meat. Troop transports crammed with Legion serfs, compliance troops, and the remnants of Ultramar auxiliary regiments that had managed to reach the Lion's banner. Supply vessels heavy with munitions and food and fuel, their holds stacked with everything needed to feed war on a planetary scale. It was a war machine built to grind billions of human lives to nothing and still have strength remaining to strike the next blow. In the age before the heresy, such a fleet would have been reserved for the compliance of a hostile civilization spanning a score of worlds. Now, it was turned upon a single system, lost in the dark. Below the Strategium, deep within the hull of the Invincible Reason and the other great ships that followed her, the opening of the Dreadwing vaults gathered pace. Servo engines whined as maglocks released on sealed chambers that had slept since the dark days of the Rangdan Xenocides. Coded wards flared along black iron doors, denying demonic attention as ancient weapons tasted the air again. Atomics sat in there, cradles like sleeping suns, wrapped in script-bound casings and chained with sigils. Rad weapons, their cores glowing with sick light, were marched from containment by hooded serfs who would die early and painfully for the honor of bearing them. Phosphex canisters, sealed with triple wards, were slotted into magazines and grenade racks, each one a promise of fire that would never truly go out. Warp-touched engines and relic devices, whose names were recorded only in the most forbidden of librarious tomes, throbbed with sullen power as their machine spirits woke to the scent of impending slaughter. The Dreadwing walked among these things with the ease of men moving through a familiar chapel. They were not comfortable. No one ever became comfortable with such tools, but they were practiced. For them, the line between victory and atrocity had long ago been erased by necessity and the Lion's command. On the Strategium floor, a captain of the line stepped forward. His armor was marked, with the vertical sword of his order and the double wings of the Legion. His hair was iron grey, his features drawn into the permanent frown of a man who had spent most of his life looking down the length of a bolter. He knelt, one fist to the deck, and bowed his head. "My Lord Primarch," he said, "a question, if it is permitted." The Lion regarded him without expression. "Ask." "Zepeth," the captain said, "is it to be saved or erased?" There was no tremor in his voice. He knew, as they all knew, that the answer would send tens of thousands, perhaps millions, to their deaths. The question was not born of mercy. It was born of the need to plan, to know whether his men would be deployed as liberators or executioners. The Lion let the question hang for a moment. All conversation in the Strategium died. Even the hum of the hologlobe seemed to dim, as if the machines themselves were waiting. "We will see what remains worth saving," he said at last. It was not a reassurance. It was not a threat. It was a simple truth, spoken by a man who had seen too many worlds turned into puppets dancing on warp strings. The officers bowed their heads, accepting it. For the First Legion, duty did not concern itself with comfort. "Make ready," the Lion continued. "Plot our course through the storm. Advise the fleet masters that translation will be undertaken at once. Kurz runs somewhere ahead of us. The traitor legions spread their scripture in blood. We will answer both." He turned away then, back toward the armored viewports and the impossible sky beyond. The ruin storm raged in colors that had no name in any sane language, tides of unreality crashing against the invisible armor of the Geller fields. In that boiling madness, things moved, shadows of titanic shapes, glimpses of eyes large as cities, eddies of screaming light. The warp pressed itself against the hull like a living thing eager to intrude. The fleet's engines flared. Translation engines began their cycle, tearing at the membrane between real space and the howling sea beyond. One by one, the great ships of the First Legion aligned themselves along the vector that led towards Zepeth, their prows pointing into a storm that had already devoured legions and empires. The lion did not flinch. His course was straight and unbending. Conrad Kurz, the Word-Bearers, the World-Eaters, all of them were names on a single growing tally of debts. The Primarch of the First intended to balance that ledger with fire. Somewhere in the dark, alarms began to scream as the fleet plunged deeper into the ruin storm. But above them all, for those who were there and survived to write of it, another sound was louder still. The steady tread of a hunter who intended to walk through hell until he found his prey. There are sermons that last an hour, and there are sermons that last a lifetime. The Word-Bearers specialize in both. On the worlds they choose to break, the lecture. Hall is the horizon. The congregation is a population count measured in millions, and the punctuation is delivered by artillery. They speak in verses of fire and counterpoint of screaming. Every city toppled, every shrine torn down and rebuilt in an image pleasing to their new gods, is another paragraph in an endless, howling scripture. The World-Eaters do not preach with words at all. Their homily is the roar of chain teeth through armor, rib, and spine, the crash of ceramite boots through skulls already split. They are the bloody emphasis at the end of each line, the exclamation of slaughter that makes the Word-Bearers' philosophy real. Together they pen their doctrine across continents, one with litany and symbol, the other with industrialized murder. Zepeth was one such page. The city of Antihilate had once been a jewel of the lower marches of Ultramar. It had never rivaled Macragge's splendor, nor Calth's industry, but it had been orderly and prosperous by any sane measure. It sat between sea and stone like a fortress carved by an artist, its hab spires rising in orderly ranks, its manufactoria belching clean smoke according to prescribed schedules, its plazas and civic shrines laid out along perfect arcs, dictated by Guilliman's codifications. 5 million souls had lived and labored there, backs bent beneath a yoke they had been told was glorious, and many of them had believed it. Now, under a sky bruised by the ruin storm's distant glare, Antihilate was very close to becoming a single, monolithic altar. On a balcony that had once belonged to a civic overseer, a giant in crimson and scripture-covered plate watched the progress of that transformation. His armor was lacquered the color of heartblood, trimmed in black. Every plate was inscribed with tiny, perfect script, lines of verses and invocations crawling over him like an infestation of runes. Horned censers hung from chains at his belt, spilling incense and reeking smoke that did little to cut the stench rising from the streets below. He was a dark apostle of the Word-Bearers, and his name was written in no imperial record that survived. He had abandoned that name long ago, as men once destined for the priesthood had shed theirs when they took on the vestments of their office. Now he was merely a voice, a throat through which the gods chose to speak. "Raise the next sequence," he said, his words amplified through his vox grill, carrying across the plaza like a curse. Below him, the remains of Antihilate's central square writhed. The decorative tiles and inlaid sigils of the Ultramar civil cult had long since been shattered. The statues of Guilliman and the Emperor that had once stood sentinel there lay in pieces, faces hacked away, limbs scattered. In their place, the Word-Bearers had raised crude timber scaffolds and iron frames, lattices of bar and chain on which they hung their offerings. The offerings screamed as they were hauled higher. They were men mostly, men in torn uniforms, men in workers' overalls, men in robes stripped of their insignia. Some cried the Emperor's name as the chains bit into their flesh. Some prayed to no one. Some cursed the crimson giants above them. It did not matter. The Dark Apostle listened to them all and heard only the rising note of devotion. The chains hauled them upward, jerking until their feet left the ground and they swung above the blood-slick stones. Other chains waited above, and other hooks. In time, if the acolytes did their work well, the dangling lines of bodies would lock into the next layer of the structure, rising in the square's center, adding flesh to the growing tower. Antihilate was never meant to be a city, the Dark Apostle said. Whether to his followers or the heir was unclear. It was meant to be this. It was always meant to be this. A node, a channel, a chalice. A lesser word-bearer at his side, helm tucked beneath one arm, nodded in fervent agreement. His lips moved, echoing his master's words, committing them to memory so he could repeat them later to his own charges. The Dark Apostle did not spare him a glance. His attention was on the tower. It rose from the broken tiles like a bone driven through the city's heart. At its base, the earliest layers were already dry, the bodies there stripped to near skeletons by time and heat and the endless attentions of scavenger flocks. Higher up, the corpses were fresher. The acolytes, those mortal men who had shown sufficient enthusiasm in their worship, worked along hanging gantries with hooks and knives, making sure each new offering was slotted into place according to the patterns laid down in the Apostle's vision. From a distance, from orbit perhaps, the structure would look almost geometric. Up close, it was a crawling mass of limbs and faces and tangled chains. Blood ran from it in glistening sheets, down channels cut into the plaza's stone, into gutters that fed, the sigil etched around its base. Around that circle, cultists and legion serfs knelt in their hundreds. They were a ragged mixture of native Zepathans and imported chattel from other conquered worlds. Men stripped of name and past, clad in rags and scraps of armor, branded with fresh sigils that still smoked. Their voices rolled in waves as they chanted the litanies the word-bearers had given them, their words broken by sobbing and the occasional vomit of those whose nerves had finally failed. The Dark Apostle inhaled deeply. The air was thick with the iron stink of blood, with human fear, with smoke from burning temples and manufactoria. Beneath those mortal scents, like a current under a river, he felt something else. The warp sang. It was not loud, not yet, not here, not on this single world, this single city, but the Dark Apostle was connected by rite and pact, and the scars on his soul to others like him across Ultramar. He felt the echo of Kalth's poisoned void, of smaller, nameless worlds whose names only the gods remembered. Each was a pinprick of pain in reality. Together, they became a chorus. "Do you hear them?" he asked. His attendant frowned, uncertain. "Hear who, preacher?" "Them," the apostle said, and gestured vaguely at the horizon. "The ones who believe themselves saved. The ones still praying to the corpse who never answers. The ones burning with confusion and denial as their cities fall around them. They scream, brother. Across Ultramar they scream. Every throat raised to the silent heavens adds another line to our scripture." He smiled behind his grill. It was not a pleasant expression. "We are not just killing a world," he said. "We are teaching it." A fresh roar shook the air, drowning the mortal chanting. It was not a sound made for words. It was the sound of engines and chain weapons and transhuman throats, all bellowing the same thing: rage without limit. The World Eaters were on the move. From his vantage point, the Dark Apostle could see the northern Hab stacks, those immense towers of plasteel and ferrocrete, where hundreds of thousands had once lived, according to neat administratum designations. Now they were lit from within by fire. Sections of their flanks had been torn open by bombardment, spilling out twisted metal and smoke, and things that might once have been human. In and among those wounds, blue and white armor moved. The World Eaters had daubed their plate in drying blood, until individual heraldry was little more than suggestion beneath the mess. They roared as they charged along buckling gantries and collapsed transit lines, chain axes and teethers, and gladiatorial blades rising and falling in a mad rhythm. Their helms were fashioned in the shape of snarling beasts or blank visors, their backs studded with spikes on which they had already impaled trophies taken from the fallen. At their head ran a champion, bulked out in Terminator plate that looked almost too small for him. Brass studs and crimson scripture plates crawled across his armor. A crest of chain links rattled along his helm, each link hung with a tooth or a fragment of bone. In his hands, he carried a chain axe the size of a mortal man, its engine howling. He hit a knot of fleeing militia like a meteor. Last shots spattered harmlessly against ancient plate. A few found weak points and left smoldering scars on seals and exposed cabling, but the champion did not slow. His weapon rose and fell, tearing men apart as easily as a child might scatter stalks of grain. Those who tried to surrender, falling to their knees with hands raised, died like the rest. The World Eaters were not here to win a battle. They were not here to accept submission or negotiate compliance terms. They were here to erase a people. Behind him, his company followed suit. Some shouted half-remembered warrior creeds. Most simply roared the one word that underpinned their entire existence now: blood. The Dark Apostle watched them work and felt no disquiet. The World Eaters were crude, perhaps, but they were very effective punctuation. They made his sermons real in the simplest way possible. "More bodies for the tower," he said. "Make sure the retrieval cadres follow in their wake. I want the flesh that falls this day put to use. This city will not be wasted." The acolyte at his side bowed low. "As you say, preacher, the cadavers will be collected. The streets will be cleared." "Not just the streets," the apostle replied. "The districts. The districts feed the city. The city feeds the tower. The tower feeds the gods. There are no wasted links in the chain." To him, it was all very simple. Every mortal on Zepath was a resource. They could be a worshipper, kneeling at the base of the tower, mouths open as they screamed praise and fear in equal measure. They could be a corpse, stacked into the structure, or burned as an offering, their souls torn free and reshaped by the powers watching. Or they could be something more useful, a foothold, a vessel for a fragment of warp-made flesh. Those were rare, and he cultivated them carefully, but in the end, they too were spent. There were no other categories. There was no such thing as neutrality, or non-combatant, or innocent. A man who refused to worship would die just as surely as one who embraced the gods with both arms. The only difference lay in how useful his death would be. "Preacher," the acolyte said, a note of awe creeping into his voice. "The casualty tallies from the outer districts. The scribes' counts pass into the high hundreds of millions, and still the city feeds us more." "Of course it does," the apostle murmured. "This is only one city. The agri-continents have yet to be fully harvested. The orbital platforms are still being converted. Antihilate is merely where we place the cup. The blood of a system will fill it." His words were not metaphor. Above the city, in the dark sky veined with crimson, the shapes of orbital platforms hung like malignant stars. Once, they had been defense bastions and trade hubs, their decks alive with traffic, and their cannon pointed outward to guard against raiders. Now their guns were turned inward. Macro cannon and lance turrets tracked the surface, delivering precise, punishing blasts at districts that dared to show signs of organized resistance. Their hab decks had been cleared of administrators and void crew. In their place, execution rings had been raised. Men were marched onto those cold steel stages in ordered blocks, hands bound, heads bowed. Word-bearer officers walked the lines, choosing a token handful to be spared for conversion, marking them with a touch. The rest were lined up along the edge and pushed, one after another, into the void, their fall broadcasting a message of despair to those below who still looked up and hoped for salvation. On the agri-continents, where rolling fields had Once fed not only Zepath but systems beyond, the soil had darkened. Crops lay trampled and burned. The furrows were filled now with bodies rather than seed. Word-bearer chaplains walked those fields, sprinkling blood from censers, chanting as they went, turning the world's breadbasket into an ossuary. Auxilia units that had been stationed to protect those assets had faced a choice when the traitor fleets arrived. Some had thrown in their lot with the word-bearers, swearing new oaths, painting new sigils upon their armor. They now formed the core of traitor militia regiments, manning barricades under crimson banners. Others had attempted to stand firm, to hold the line against an enemy their training manuals had never truly prepared them to face. Most of those were dead now, written off in the butcher's ledger as near total losses, their existence reduced to a few lines of signal code in some distant data file. Zepath bled, across its continents, across its orbital paths, across its seas and skies. The casualty count rose into unfathomable heights until numbers became meaningless and only images remained. It is here, in this convergence of faith and slaughter, that one can see most clearly the parallel between the lords of the traitor legions. Lorgar of the word-bearers had always sought meaning. Even in rebellion, he needed a structure to his heresy, a creed, a shape that made sense to him. He could not simply burn a world and move on. He had to understand why, and he had to ensure that others understood as well, even if that understanding came in their final moments. Angron of the World Eaters needed nothing but slaughter. His was a hunger without language, a need to kill that did not require justification. It could be directed, perhaps, given a target, but it could not be explained. To the butcher's nails that sang in his skull and in the skulls of his sons, there was no difference between a noble cause and a venal one. There was only the ecstasy of violence. On Zepath, those two hungers were fed at the same table. Every sermon the word-bearers preached was underscored by an assault company's charge. Every tower of bone they raised was stacked from bodies the World Eaters had torn down. Antilasta was as much a shrine to Angron's love of carnage as it was a monument to Lorgar's need for doctrine. And yet, amid that nightmare, there were still men who fought as the old codes had taught them. In a shattered district on the city's southern fringe, where hab blocks had caved in around the impact craters of orbital strikes, a knot of Ultramar Auxilia held their ground. Their armor was scorched and dented, the blue and gold chevrons dulled beneath ash. Many had bandages wrapped around their limbs and heads, stained through. Their officers had been reduced to a handful of sergeants who shouted orders over the roar of incoming fire. They sheltered in the broken bones of a manufactorum, its assembly lines twisted into jagged cover. Behind them, a handful of civilians huddled, eyes wide and hollow. The Auxilia had not meant to take on that burden, but they had never truly been given a choice. When they fell back into the ruins, the civilians had followed, clinging to them as if to talismans. "Signal again," one of the sergeants growled, forcing himself upright. "Get that Vox up. Someone has to be listening out there." The Vox operator, a lean man with a shrapnel scar tearing across one cheek, shook his head, but obeyed. The set on his back was cracked, its antenna bent, its casing pitted by shrapnel. He thumbed the rune for transmission regardless, his mouth moving in a hoarse litany. "This is Auxilia Detachment Zepath Shield, designation Delta," he rasped. "Any loyalist elements, respond. Repeat, any loyalist elements, respond. We are under traitor assault. They are word-bearers and world eaters. Population centers are falling. Casualties are beyond count. Requesting immediate support. Requesting extraction. Requesting anything." Only static answered. Static, and the distant echo of a word-bearer sermon bleeding in from another channel, some cursed lectern turned into a relay station. The sergeant slammed a fist against the wall. Dust rained down. "Keep sending," he said. until they cut our throats or the set burns out. Somewhere, someone has to hear us. Macragga, Calth, anywhere. The Legion cannot be blind forever. He did not know that the ruin storm had already rendered those hopes little more than prayers whispered into a hurricane. He did not know that, out in that storm, a different Primarch had already turned his prow toward Zepeth. All he knew was that holding the line, here, for another hour, another day, might mean that someone, somewhere, survived long enough to escape. The Auxilia fired into the advancing dark, last shots flashing. Men died. The manufacturing ghosts around them watched with blind machine optics as a microcosm of the wider war played out in their hollow. Back in Antilasta's heart, the tower of bone and flesh grew. The word-bearers had begun to work bone into the higher courses. Skeletons were stripped and wired, arranged in precise, repeating patterns. Skulls were set into niches like icons. The overall shape of the spire became clearer now. It twisted as it rose, not in a simple helix, but in a pattern whose angles hurt the eyes to follow for too long. It was not meant to be understood by unaltered minds. It was a sigil given three-dimensional form, a rune written in tendon and vertebrae. The Dark Apostle watched as his acolytes hammered iron spikes through clavicles to secure the latest additions. He could feel the tower's presence pushing outward like a slowly inflating lung. It reached across the city, across the planet, into the thin upper air where the light of the ruin storm bled through. With every body added, with every scream taken up into its mass, it grew brighter in the realm, beyond sight. "Soon," he whispered, more to the gods than to his followers. "Soon this beacon will blaze. The veil here will thin. The souls of this system will pour into the storm like a river." He closed his eyes. The warp rushed up to meet him. For a moment, he was no longer standing on a balcony above a blood-slick plaza. He was falling through a void of colors that did not exist, surrounded by the distant, muffled cries of the dying. He felt the other points of light across Ultramar where his brothers worked similar horrors. Each was a distant candle flame in a gale. Zepath, when the work was done, would be a torch. And in that tumbling dark, something else moved. It was not like the gibbering shapes that crowded at the edges of his perception, those half-formed things that pressed against the membrane of reality in the hope of being let through. It was not like the cold, cruel glimmers that marked the attention of his patrons. This presence was different. It was narrow and hard and utterly without pity, a line of purpose cutting through the storm, an iron-willed predator carving its way through the empiric sea. The Dark Apostle smiled behind his grill. He knew what it must be. There were not many wills in the galaxy that could burn so straight in such turbulence. Another Primarch had set his eyes on Zepath. Another of the Emperor's broken sons had decided this world mattered, whether as a target or an inconvenience. "Come then," he murmured, opening his eyes once more to the tower and the bleeding city below. "Come and see what scripture we have written in your father's realm. Let us test the strength of your soul against the weight of our offering." The wind shifted, carrying with it the reek of smoke and blood and engine exhaust. Above Antilasta, the sky flickered, as if some colossal unseen hand were already dragging claws across the fabric of reality, feeling for a weak point through which to thrust the blade. There is a pattern to the wars of the Imperium, once you step back far enough to see it. For most of its enemies, the Emperor forged weapons in the shape of legions, each suited to a different flavor of conquest. Some excelled at sieges, some at armored thrusts, some at void war. When he came upon a problem that could be solved with nuance or patience, he sent those sons and those armies. But there were foes that did not yield to such measured tools. There were cultures that could not be bent, only broken. There were Xeno's empires whose very existence was an affront to the imperial truth. Horrors dug out of the long night that could not be permitted to touch humanity, and yet could not be scrubbed away with ordinary fire. For those insoluble problems, he made the first. The First Legion was his original answer, the blade he lifted when there was nothing left to try but annihilation. They carried within them all the ways of war the Emperor had ever devised, and within that host, in turn, he built more specialized instruments still, the hexagrammaton, the 6 great wings of the Legion, each honed to a particular task, and among those, darkest and least spoken of, waited the Dreadwing. When the First Legion entered a war zone in force, it meant the Imperium had run out of patience. When the Dreadwing went to war, it meant the Imperium had run out of mercy. The Zepeth system felt their arrival like a wound opening in the void. Translation tore reality. The leading edge of the Dark Angel's fleet punched through the frothing tides of the ruin storm, shedding empiric lightning and the after images of impossible colors as their Geller fields dragged stubborn normality back into being around them. The flagship emerged first, a mountain of armored steel and adamantium, gun decks bristling like the spines of some titanic void beast. Around it, strike cruisers, grand cruisers and battleships clawed their way into real space, followed by their escorts, a cloud of smaller shapes, spreading out like a shoal of predators around a larger shark. For a moment, the system reeled. Vox traffic choked. Astropathic channels shrieked and then cut out, severed by the mere proximity of so many warships breaking through the veil. The star of Zepath burned on, indifferent, its light smeared by the edge of the ruin storm that lapped at the system's outer reaches. Then the guns began to speak. The Dark Angels had not arrived unopposed. A World Eater's battle barge hung in a high anchor pattern above the largest of Zepath's habitable worlds, its hull a brutal wedge of crimson and brass. It had been riding there like a hunting beast, surrounded by a loose constellation of smaller hulls, escort frigates and raider craft marked in Word-Bearer red or World Eater blue, each one scarred by past actions and festooned with fresh trophies. They had been the masters of this piece of sky, secure in the knowledge that no ordered Imperial fleet could find its way cleanly through the warp storm to challenge them. The arrival of the First Legion ended that illusion. The confrontation began at ranges so great that even macro shells looked like dust motes on Auspec's returns, specks of incandescent light flicking from one contact to another. The Dark Angel's leading formations slid into combat pattern with the smooth inevitability of endlessly rehearsed drill. Monarch's Glory, a grand cruiser whose flanks were carved with the names of 100 past compliance actions, took point. Alongside her flew 3 smaller corvettes, nimble dagger shapes that rode her wake like hunting beasts at the side of an alpha predator. "Contact in the upper band," a Vox officer intoned on Monarch's Glory's bridge, his voice steady despite the distortion rippling through every channel. "Enemy capital vessel. Designation unknown. Escorts in loose guard formation. Ident markers match corrupted World Eater and Word-Bearer codes." "Range?" asked the shipmaster, a stooped figure in dark armor, his features lit by the glow of tactical hololiths. "Closing," came the reply. "They are slow to shift heading. We have advantage." On an upper command platform, a single armored figure watched proceedings in silence. The Lion had elected not to direct this first contact personally. Void battles were the domain of specialists, and he possessed the discipline to let his tools do their work. But he stood there nonetheless, bareheaded amidst the hooded servitors and robed officers, and every man on that bridge felt his presence like a weight. "Signal the corvettes," the shipmaster ordered. "They will screen our advance. Priority targets are the escorts. Strip the beast of its teeth, then we drive for the throat." The first volleys leapt from Monarch's Glory's flanks, lines of flame streaking across the darkness. Macro cannon shells, each one the size of a small hab block, howled away toward the traitor formation. Lance batteries followed, spearing beams of concentrated starfire after them. The 3 escorts added their own voices, their lighter weapons flaring. The word-bearer raiders reacted first, veering to meet the oncoming storm. They spat back fire of their own, but they had been caught out of position, hulls half-turned as they belatedly adjusted to the sudden appearance of a fleet that should have taken weeks or months to translate through the ruinstorm. Monarch's Glory's shells reached them before they could properly reorient. One frigate simply came apart, its flank torn open from prow to spine, atmosphere and burning debris venting in a single expanding blossom of fire. Another took a lance strike full along its length, the beam drilling through its prow and out its stern, leaving a line of molten scars that spread as internal detonations raced after them. Its reactor went an instant later, turning the ship into a brief, vicious star that painted the void with wreckage. The corvettes darted in close, finishing the survivors with precise shots to engines and bridge towers. Traitor hulls spun away as cold wrecks, their vox channels fading into static. The battle barge endured the opening exchange with contemptuous strength. Macro shells hammered into its prow, bursting against layered void shields that flared and dimmed but did not fall. Lance strikes raked its heavy armor, gouging incandescent trenches, but failing to bite deep enough to cripple. It rolled ponderously on its axis, bringing more of its own gun decks to bear, and replied. Monarch's Glory shook. Warning runes flared red as enemy fire walked across her flanks, shredding outer armor plating, annihilating whole sections of exposed gun decks. Men died in those bursts of fire, reduced to vapor and frozen shards in an instant, but the cruiser held her course. Her void shields flickered, dipped, then stabilized under the prayers and curses of her tech adepts. Enemy capital vessel is altering heading, the augur, master reported, voice tight. They are not closing, they are withdrawing. On the holo display, the battle barge's icon swung about. It did not wheel to meet Monarch's Glory's charge as a berserk world-eater captain drunk on his own glory might have done. It pulled away, its engines flaring as it drove for the system's edge. Its escorts scattered, some breaking off to harry the Dark Angel's flanks, others turning to follow their larger sibling out toward the shadowed rim. Cowards, a gunnery officer muttered, before catching himself and dropping his eyes as he remembered who stood above him. Lionel Johnson watched the shifting pattern with hooded gaze. To another, the move might have looked like simple fear, a refusal to die in honest battle. He saw more than that. He saw calculation. A commander who knew when a position was untenable and chose to preserve his strength to bleed the Imperium elsewhere. A betrayal of the theatrical madness the World Eaters liked, to wear like armor. They will not die cleanly for us, he said, mostly to himself. They mean to take this ship and her sisters away to carve at other worlds. The shipmaster glanced up, old eyes meeting the Primarch's for the space of a heartbeat. We can pursue, Lord. Press the advantage, drive them down before they can escape. The Lion considered. In the wake of the battle barge, he could sense the ruin storm's turbulence gathering. The closer a vessel moved toward the system's edge, the thinner the membrane between real space and the raging sea beyond. To chase the traitor capital ship now would mean following it into waters where navigation became less a matter of skill and more a matter of blind fate. Hold formation, he ordered. Cripple their escorts. Harrow the barge as long as it remains within reliable range, but do not follow them into the storm. He turned away from the void, then away from the glimpses of enemy hulls flaring and dying, and looked instead to the hololithic projection in the center of the bridge. There, beneath the shifting icons of fleets, hung the image that mattered most. Zepath's primary world turned slowly, a sphere of blue and green ash gray under drifting bands of cloud. As the Dark Angel's auger nets unfolded, layers of data began to stack around it. Topographical scans, thermal readings, vox ghosts, the echoes of long-dead astropathic screams. Each pass of the sensors stripped away another mask until the surface lay revealed in all its wounded truth. Magnification on the primary population centers, the Lion said. The hollow image shifted. Continents swelled, cities coming into view as clusters of heat and structure. Many of those clusters were dim now, their infrastructure shattered, their power grids broken. Some burned like coals, entire regions aflame. Along one seaboard, where once an orderly march of hab complexes and manufactoria had lined the coast, there ran instead a continent-spanning scar, a strip of land turned to glass and fused stone by some hideous concentration of force. Here, an augur adept said, pointing with a trembling quill stylus. The city of ANNIHILATES, Lord, or what remains of it. The view centered on that location. The city's grid lines were warped, buildings blown apart or sagging where structural supports had been torn out. Streets that had once thrummed with traffic now lay choked with debris and the indistinct shapes of the dead. Heat blooms showed active fires still glowering in the heart of the ruins, and from that heart rose a single structure that offended the eye even in ghostly projection. It speared upward from the city's central plaza, higher than any of the original Hab spires had ever reached, a twisting column of material that did not match any pre-existing architectural record for Zephath. Its surface was uneven, jagged, a palimpsest of knots and protrusions. Auspex picked feeds, translated and refined, provided a closer image, and the truth became clear. Bones, skulls wired together into latticework, rib cages stacked into arches, limbs pinned and chained to support higher layers. The Tower of ANNIHILATES was made entirely of its own citizens, assembled into a pattern that obeyed some blasphemous geometry only the word-bearers fully understood. "A sermon you can see from orbit," murmured one of the mortal officers, before realizing he had spoken aloud and snapping his jaw shut. The Lion studied the tower without outward reaction. To those around him, he seemed as unmovable as ever, iron carved into a man's shape. Inside, the sight struck him like a cold nail. The Night Haunter had always loved theatre. Kurz's atrocities were not merely cruelty. They were messages, painstakingly arranged. Bodies arranged in tableaus, warnings written in blood in languages the victims would understand. Patterns of killings designed to suggest future horrors. Every slaughter was a communication, a twisted exchange between predator and prey. This was different. There was no nuance here, no perverse artistry beyond the bare requirements of the ritual. The tower was meant for the eyes of gods, not men. Its patterns faced the warp, not the surviving Zephathans. It did not whisper of what would come. It simply drank. "This is not Kurz," the Lion said quietly. Farith Redloss had come to stand at his left shoulder, helm mag locked to his belt, now that there was no immediate need for void seals. The scars of his bare face were a map of other, older wars. He followed the Primarch's gaze, taking in the bone spire, the dead city around it. "No, Lord," he agreed. "This is Lorgar's work, or those who think as he does." The Lion grunted once, an acknowledgement, a wordless admission that this hunt, like so many before it, might be leading him along a path that curved away from his true quarry. The Night Haunter was somewhere else, somewhere the shadows were still arranged just so, each corpse placed to whisper a particular accusation. Here he had found only the rote cruelty of the new faith. It did not matter, not enough to alter his course. The traitor legions had still come here. They had still built this obscenity. Removing it from the ledger of the living was still a task worthy of the first. "Deployments," he said. "I want no fewer than 10,000 of our brothers on the ground in the first wave." The shipmaster frowned slightly. "The ruin storm is still fouling translation in the upper atmosphere, Lord. Drops will be hazardous. We can stagger the descent to reduce losses, but even so, we may lose craft. We will lose craft, the Lion corrected, without heat. We will lose men. That is not in question. The question is only whether we lose enough to break this thing before it sets like bone. The longer we delay, the deeper its roots grow. And the auxilia? Redloss asked. He did not say which. Auxilia. Those few human forces that had managed to cling to the Lion's banner through the chaos of recent campaigns were a ragged patchwork of shattered regiments, elements savaged by earlier engagements and barely knit together again. All of them, the Primarch said. Every regiment that can still carry a rifle and walk to a drop cradle. Their world is burning. They may as well burn with it in the right direction. There was no cruelty in his tone, only a flat recognition of fact. The mortal soldiers who would be poured into Zepath's gravity well would not survive. Those who did evade the Word-Bearer's knives or the World-Eater's axes would still carry the taint of what they had witnessed, what they had fought through. Men did not walk away from such battles unchanged. Somewhere, a scrivener of souls might have called such thoughts mercy. Lionel Johnson did not. He saw only the most efficient way to spend what he had been given. "Advise the wings," he continued. "Ravenwing reconnaissance elements will spearhead above the main drops, mapping the worst of the storm fronts and enemy air assets. Ironwing armor will deploy as close to Anti-Laster as the conditions permit. Dreadwing formations will hold in reserve until we have clear sight of the primary ritual sites." Redloss inclined his head. "Standard compliance pattern, Lord?" The Lion shook his head once. "No. Zepath is already lost, Farith. Look at it. Look at that tower and the scars on the continents, and tell me there is anything here worth codifying, anything worth integrating into any future realm." The Dreadwing commander did as he was bid. His eyes flicked across the rotating hollow image, reading the devastation written there in the same way a veteran might read terrain. He saw the glassed swaths where orbital weapons had scoured the soil down to lifeless rock. He saw the emptied oceans where something vast had drunk deeply and left only basins of stinking mud behind. He saw the broken spine of Anti-Laster and imagined the carnival of butchery that had raised the bone spire in its heart. "No, Lord," he said, "there is nothing here but meat and ash." "Then there will be no talk of compliance," the Lion said. "No administratum briefs, no lectures to terrified survivors about their duties in some future reconstruction. We are not here to win this world to a cause. We are here to break the enemy, and if I deem it necessary, to raise whatever still dares to stand afterwards." His gaze hardened. "Prepare eschaton contingencies. If the tower reaches some threshold I cannot yet see, if the rituals there threaten to root too deep, I will not hesitate to wipe the slate clean." Redloss's scarred lips twitched. It might have been the ghost of a smile. "As you command." The Dreadwing stands ready. Far below, in cavernous bays deep within the fleet's bellies, the machinery of planetary assault woke. Stormbirds sat in ordered ranks, their hulls painted in muted greens and bone white, their flanks scarred by the marks of past drops. Thunderhawks, smaller but no less lethal, were cradled in launch clamps, their engines cycling up with a rising whine. Mass landers waited in rows like slumbering beasts, their holds already packed with infantry, armor, and artillery. Legionaries marched in, squads taking their pre-assigned positions, with the calm efficiency of men for whom this was simply another day at war. Librarians walked among them, voices low as they shored up the mental wards that would be needed to endure descent through a sky already tainted by ritual. Chaplains moved as well, Crozius hafts held like weapons at rest, their words chosen less to comfort than to sharpen. The auxilia followed, men in patched armor bearing regimental markings from half a dozen different worlds, climbed the ramps of bulk transports with expressions that ran the gamut from grim resolve to glass-eyed shock. Some, exchanged a few last words with comrades. Others clutched at small tokens of faith or habit. All of them felt the ship tremble around them as the fleet adjusted orbit and the engines spooled toward the power levels needed to hurl such mass down into gravity's grasp. In one of the Dreadwing mustering chambers, Farith Redloss addressed his officers. The space was austere, lit by a few harsh lumen strips that threw long shadows. No banners hung here. No trophies decorated the walls. The only symbols were those etched into the armor of the gathered warriors and the sigils glowing faintly on the sealed cases that lined the bulkheads. "Zepath is dead," he told them, his voice a rasp that carried without effort. "The body still twitches, but the soul has been bartered away. Do not let the presence of a few surviving mortals confuse you. They are remnants, not a people. We are not here to shepherd them. We are not here to lecture them. We are here because our Primarch has hunted something into this corner of the void, and the beasts he chases have left an infection behind." He gestured toward the picture rune of the bone tower, projected in harsh relief on the far wall. Even these hardened killers felt something twist in their guts at the sight. "That is what we have come to cut out," he said. "We will descend in secondary waves once the other wings have secured anchor points. Our task is to seek out the worst concentrations of corruption and apply the only medicine we carry: phosphex for the massed cults, rad burners for the ritual chambers, atomics where the foundations need to be broken." He let his gaze travel across them, meeting helm lenses and bare eyes alike. There will be no measured application of force, no careful isolation of targets. This is not a place that can be healed. It can only be prevented from spreading any further than it already has. He did not need to tell them that many of them would not return. The Dreadwing did not concern themselves with such accounting. They were not a shield. They were a hammer whose head was already cracked from use, and each blow they struck drove those fractures deeper. When the briefing was done, they moved to their own transports. Behind sealed adamantium doors, they checked their exotic munitions, performed rites over weapons whose very existence would have horrified many of their brother Astartes. They waited, patient as loaded guns, for the signal. In the upper decks, klaxons howled. Hatches rolled open with the grinding roar of ancient machinery. The hangar bays of the Dark Angel's fleet were titanic caverns, their ceilings lost beyond gantries and crane arms. Now, as drop order runes burned green, they filled with movement. Stormbirds thundered down their launch rails, engines screaming. Thunderhawks peeled out of their clamps and arrowed toward the void, their wings folding and unfolding as they adjusted for atmosphere. Mass landers, ugly and functional, swung out into the dark like blunt-nosed fists. Each craft carried squads, companies, entire battalions of men, armor columns crouched on maglocks, artillery pieces chained to their decks. From a vantage point on the flagship's observation gallery, the Lion watched his sons fall away from him. Trails of blue and white flame marked each launch, streaks that curved toward the distant planet. For a moment they resembled a swarm of meteors, some ancient shower of celestial bodies drawn down toward the gravity well. Then the first of them hit the upper atmosphere and began to burn. The ruin storm had not fully receded from Zepath's sky. Its fringe still licked at the world's ionosphere, turning clouds into lurid crimson swirls, bending lightning into unnatural patterns. As the Dark Angel's dropships plunged through that turbulent layer, their hulls shook. Warning runes flared in cockpits and hold compartments. Gouts of empiric fire clawed at shields and wards, leaving smears of unreality on viewing ports before they burned away. In their cradles, mortal soldiers retched, clutching at restraints as their minds recoiled from the brief brush with the storm's madness. The Astartes held fast, bolter muzzles resting on their knees, eyes closed in contemplation, or narrowed in anticipation. They had made this journey before. They would make it again, until the day their armor failed to carry them. Below, the land waited. Antilasta's spire rose like a single accusing finger, pointing at the heavens. Its bone lattice did not sway in the high winds that tore at the fumes and smoke above the dead city. It stood rigid and unyielding, a monument to the gods that had been fed with its making. As the first contrails of descending craft scored the sky, nothing in that tower moved. No cultist wavered in his chant. No acolyte paused in his grisly labor. The dark apostle at its crown felt the tremor in the warp as the Primarch's fleet committed and smiled. The tower did not bow. It did not burn. It stood, pale and obscene, a challenge driven up from the corpse of a city to meet the blades falling from orbit. Antilasta was not the first city to die in the age of betrayal, and it would not be the last, but it stands as one of the clearest examples of what chaos truly is when stripped of all lies. It had been a functioning organ in the body of Ultramar, a place of work and law and modest pride. It possessed manufactoria, transit spires, civic temples, and environmental systems tuned to the comfort of its 5 million souls. Its killing brought no strategic gain worth the cost. No irreplaceable arsenal was captured there. No irreplaceable data vault cracked open. There were easier planets to strip for resources, easier positions to hold as strongpoints. The Word-bearers and World-eaters did not choose Antilasta because it was important. They chose it because it could be made to scream in a way that pleased their gods. They took a city and, through slow and deliberate effort, turned it into a symbol. That was the cruelty. Not the death, not even the scale of it, but the decision to expend so much time and thought on making that death meaningful to something that did not need meaning at all. The Dreadwing came down into what remained of it as a surgeon might open a cadaver for study. The spearhead landed along the ruined outskirts, where hab blocks had slumped into ash drifts, and the wind had scoured away any last signs of human movement. Stormbirds knifed through the murky cloud layers, engines howling as they forced Zepath's poisoned sky to make room. They dropped low over shattered structures, retros flaring, and disgorged squads of dark angels in staggered formations. Dust and grey ash billowed around them, cloaking green armor in dull powder. Farith Redloss moved at their head, a dark, hulking shape, striding through a world gone colorless. His plate drank the weak light, the crimson wing of his order marking him out only when a flicker of fire reflected from it. Around him, the Dreadwing advanced with a measured, methodical tread. Bolters held ready, auspex arrays linked through helm lenses. They swept each street, each collapsed square, with the unhurried efficiency of men who had walked through too many graveyards to be unnerved by another. Every window they passed was empty. Glass had been blown out or melted, leaving black sockets staring down at them. Doors hung crooked or lay flat, mouths without teeth through which only the wind moved. Ash lay thick in the gutters and in the hollows of the broken pavement, coating the boots of the advancing Astartes, softening their footsteps. There were no birds, no vermin, no distant thrum of generators, only the whisper of ash sliding and the occasional crack of stressed metal somewhere in the ruins, as if the city's bones were settling at last. "Movement?" Redloss asked over the squad channel. "Negative," came the reply from one, "of the point elements. No heat signatures beyond residuals from past fires. No Vox traffic that is not our own. This district is dead, Lord." Dead, Redloss thought. Not quiet, not deserted. Dead. The difference mattered. He lifted his gaze from the immediate frontage and looked toward the city's heart. Even through the pall of smoke and haze, the thing in the center was visible. It rose above the ruined skyline like a pale thorn, a tower that should not exist, twisted and unnatural against the horizon. "Make for the central plaza," he ordered. "We clear as we go. Anything that moves and is not one of ours dies." They advanced. The route took them through districts that had once been dense with life. They passed playgrounds where rusted frames poked from drifts of grey. They crossed plazas where trees had been reduced to charred spikes. They stepped over the occasional corpse that had not yet been collected for the tower, broken forms half buried in the dust, faces turned toward the sky as if asking a question that had never been answered. At junctions, Redloss paused to let his brothers check flanking avenues. They found no barricades, no spent shell casings scattered in enough density to indicate sustained firefights. Here and there, a las rifle lay abandoned, its charge pack missing or drained. The signs did not speak of hard-fought block-by-block battles. They spoke of swift collapse, of a population ripped out of its own city and dragged toward a single point. As they drew closer, the air changed. The ash underfoot thickened, clumping around their greaves. Flies appeared, a sluggish, buzzing cloud that rose and fell around them, their bodies fat from feeding. The stink of rot and old blood grew stronger, cutting through the more neutral sense of dust and burned plasteel. The tower dominated the central district. Antilasta's heart had been a broad, multi-tiered plaza, ringed by administration buildings and civic shrines. Now those structures sagged inward, their faces peeled away by blast and fire. The surface of the plaza itself was almost entirely obscured by the base of the tower, a sprawling mass of material piled and arranged over every inch of available stone. At a distance, it had looked like a simple column of pale matter, irregular but essentially singular. At its base, among it, the truth became clearer. Redloss halted at the edge, his boots scuffing against lines etched into the stone. Symbols, cut deep and filled with blackened blood, circled the tower's foundation. Some were runes he recognized from captured word-bearer scripture. Others made his eyes ache even to look at, wrong angles that seemed to twist against his comprehension. He stepped over them without ceremony and walked on until he could lay a gauntleted hand against the tower itself. Bone. So much bone. Not the crude piles he had seen on other worlds, where victims had been thrown together in heaps and left for carrion to sort. This was something else. Skeletons had been stripped of remaining flesh, cleaned, then wired and pinned into latticework. Skulls were arranged in spirals, eye sockets empty, teeth bared, ribs interlocked in arches. Vertebrae formed cables and cords, twined together into strength that defied their original purpose. Every length of limb, every joint, had been placed with intent. Yes, the overall effect was monstrous, but it was a monstrous order rather than random filth. Someone had followed a design. Redloss moved slowly around the base, his cradle-locked bolter tracking with him, as his other hand brushed the tower's surface. Metal pins rattled against ceramite. Loose teeth skittered down, clicking among the piled femurs. "This is not a cairn," he said over the open channel. "It is a machine." One of his escort, a veteran with a half-melted helm crest from an earlier campaign, nodded stiffly. "A machine for what, Lord?" "Faith," Redloss said. "Their kind of faith. They have stacked their devotions into something the warp can see." Behind him, a figure in white trimmed armor approached, helm lenses glowing a colder shade than the rest. The Legion apothecary moved with the careful tread of a man used to working in places where the ground itself could be treacherous. His Narthesium arm whirred softly as auto-injectors and saws cycled in readiness. "Permission to examine, Commander?" he asked. Redloss gestured assent. "Take your readings. Tell me what you can." The apothecary stepped in close, his armor almost brushing the tower. He ran his instruments over the nearest section, scanners playing over bone, the ghost tracing of lingering tissue, the residue of decayed ligaments and dried marrow. His helm tilted as he studied the returning data. "This section here," he said, pointing with a delicate motion to a ring of skulls near the base. These are older men, judging by cranial fusion and dental wear. Many decades of life behind them. Probably administrators, elders, perhaps civic leaders. He moved his scanner upward. Above them, adult males in their prime, tibia and femur length, epiphyseal closure. Workers, soldiers, capable labor force. The bulk of the structure seems to be built from that layer. He adjusted a setting, the rune glow on his instruments shifting. Higher still, smaller bodies, adolescent bone growth. The fusing of long bones is not complete. And above that, smaller still, children. There was no shock in his voice, only clinical assessment. Apothecaries of the legions had long ago learned that reacting to what they saw would only drain energy better spent on the work before them. "How long?" Redlos asked. The apothecary paused, cycling his scans, comparing data along different vertical slices of the tower. "The bones at the base are leached," he said. "Weathered. They have been exposed for a significant time. Days at least, likely more, the higher. Tears show less exposure. Some still carry traces of soft tissue, connective matter. These cadavers were added more recently. The pattern does not match a single mass killing event. It indicates multiple harvesting cycles over an extended period." "Meaning?" Redlos said softly. "They did not butcher the city in one moment of madness. They took their time. They selected, they sorted, they cleaned. They built this like a sculptor builds a statue." "Yes, Lord," the apothecary replied. "Slow, deliberate work. Ritualized, not a quick slaughter." Around them, the rest of the Dreadwing squads formed a loose defensive ring, bolters trained outward. Their helm lenses flicked from alley mouths to shattered doorways, then back to the tower again. Some part of their minds could not help but count. Every skull, every pair of empty sockets. There were millions here, not all of the cities dead perhaps, but enough to feel like an entire population pressed together into one obscene monument. The tower groaned faintly as a hot wind gusted through the plaza, bone and wire settling against itself. A cascade of dust fell from some higher projection, pattering across the plates of the Astartes below. "Contact!" came a voice over the vox, cutting through the quiet. "Stormbird inbound. Priority identification." Redlos looked up. A dark shape knifed through the murk above the plaza, engines howling as it fought the turbulent air, still stained by the ruinstorm's touch. Its lines were elegant, despite the scars that webbed its hull, the sigils of the First Legion stark against the smoke. It circled once, burning off speed, then came in to land at the plaza's edge. Retro thrusters hurled dust and bone fragments into a storm around it.
If you'd like to support the channel, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe. Now let's get back into the video.
When the ramp crashed down, Lionel Johnson walked out into the ash. He wore no helm. His features were cut in severe lines, as if the same hand that had carved the tower had chosen to work on flesh as well. His eyes were pale, their color almost washed away by the light of the broken sky. His armor bore the marks of recent void war, fresh scoring and melted edges overlaying older dents and scratches. The plaza seemed to shrink as he stepped onto it. Even for transhuman warriors, his presence pressed down like additional gravity. The Dreadwings straightened instinctively, saluting in the way of their legion. Redlos stepped forward and bowed his head. "Lord," he said, "welcome to Antihilate." The lion's gaze had already gone past him. He looked up at the tower, taking in its entire obscene stretch in a single, unhurried sweep. From the blood-caked base to the twisting crown lost in low cloud, he measured it with his eyes, as if it were a fortification to be breached or a beast to be cut apart. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. In his mind, he walked back through years of similar sights. Cities shelled to rubble by Xeno's artillery. Human enclaves burned out by compliance. Actions that had gone harder than planned. worlds that had failed their tithes and been subjected to harsh correction. Atrocity was not new to him. He had ordered it when he believed it necessary. He had seen men and things beyond men indulge in it, for reasons that made sense only to them. What sat before him now was different. There was purpose in it, yes, but not rational purpose, not the brutal arithmetic of war, where the destruction of a target served a clear aim. This was an attempt to impose meaning on murder, to make each life taken part of a pattern that said something to unseen listeners. The thought that so much deliberation, so much craft, had been poured into arranging the bones of a city's children in ways that would amuse distant, uncaring gods made something cold move in the Primarch's chest. He did not merely hate the cruelty, he hated the need behind it, the hunger to dress horror in robes of significance. "Report," he said at last, voice flat. Redloss outlined the findings. The absence of enemy forces in the immediate area, the signs of careful construction, the apothecary's assessment of multiple harvest cycles, the lack of any significant resistance on their approach. He finished with a gesture at the tower itself. "They made this with patience," he said. "They wanted it to be seen." The lion's gaze did not shift from the structure. "It has been seen," he said. "Now it will be forgotten." A burst of static hissed over the command voxnet, followed by a clear tone. One of the Fleet Link officers, helm marked with additional cogitator studs, tilted his head as if listening to a distant voice. "Transmission from orbit, Lord," the man said. "It comes from the Monarch's glory, collated from the fleet's organet. The traitor capital vessels are gone. The battle barge translated out beyond the edge of the system. All remaining void assets are derelicts or gutted hulks. Surface scans indicate only scattered pockets of Word-Bearer and World-Eater forces remaining. Cultist concentrations are significant, but disorganized. In other words," the Lion said, "they have done their work and moved on." "Yes, Lord," came the answer. "Zepath appears to have been abandoned as a completed offering." The Primarch closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Kurz's shadow slipped through his thoughts, the memory of that hateful, haunted face thrown into relief by the tower of bone before him. "Not here, brother. You did not wait for me here. You left only your allies and their toys." He might have raged, another man. He might have cursed the wasted effort, the journey through the storm, the time spent chasing specters while the wider war burned. The Lion did neither. Rage was a flare, brief and bright. He preferred cold fires, the kind that burned slowly and reshaped what they fed upon. "Very well," he thought. "If this world is nothing but a corpse left in your wake, I will. Make sure the scavengers break their teeth on its bones." "Farith," he said, opening his eyes, "this city is already dead. This tower is a conduit to powers that grow fat on what they have done here. We are going to break it, not with care, not with reverence, with force." Redloss's scarred mouth curved in something like satisfaction. "Your will, Lord." "I want grav tugs and haulers brought forward," the Lion continued. "Every heavy vehicle that can be spared. We will chain this thing and drag it down piece by piece. At the same time, artillery will pound its structure. No controlled demolition, no attempt to preserve any fragment for study. I want its carefully drawn lines turned into rubble so utterly mixed that even the warp cannot read it." Somewhere behind them, the apothecary murmured a brief acknowledgement and began transmitting the necessary requisition codes. Across the battered city, Vox units crackled as motor pools and armor columns received new orders. Engines coughed into life, tracks rattled. Within a short span, the first of the grav haulers rumbled into the plaza. They were ugly machines, squat and wide, designed to shift heavy loads through void ports and ship holds. Their engines whined, pushing against gravity with thudding pulses. Servitors and mortal drivers guided them into position as Dreadwing specialists directed the placement of chains and mag clamps. Great links of adamantium were hauled around the lower sections of the tower, biting into bone and wire. Hooks found purchase in hollows and gaps. Each line was tightened until it sang with strain. The haulers crouched under the growing load, engines idling like beasts readying themselves for a pull. At the edge of the plaza, artillery pieces were unlimbered. Siege guns, their barrels stained by long use, were angled upward. Shells were loaded, breaches slammed home. Targeting runes flickered as their machine spirits aligned on the tower's flanks. Fire by sequence, Redloss ordered over the local vox. Do not stop until the structure is moving. Then do not stop until it stops forever. The first volley hammered out. Shells screamed in on arcing trajectories, trailing smoke. They struck midway up the tower's length, exploding in bursts of fire and bone fragments. The tower shuddered, a ripple of motion running through its obscene height. Skulls burst like rotten fruit. Rib cages snapped. Sections of carefully arranged geometry collapsed into a choking fall. At the same moment, the grav haulers lunged forward. Engines roared, grav plates pushing against the plaza's cracked surface. Chains snapped taut. The base of the tower groaned, the sound a deep, grinding protest that set teeth on edge even through helm seals. Again, Redloss snarled. More artillery, more shells, impact after impact, battering a structure that had never been designed to endure such treatment. The tower began to lean, slowly at first, then more, visibly, its crown listing toward one side, as the pulls of the grav tugs and the concussive blows of the shells conspired. Bone rained down. Shards clattered against ceramite. A skull struck the shoulder of a Dreadwing legionary and bounced away, jaw breaking. The man did not flinch. Above, near the tower's twisted summit, something screamed. It was not a mortal voice. It was a rising, multi-layered wail that cut across vox channels and crawled under armor and flesh. The air around the spire shimmered, colors twisted, becoming too vivid in some places and leached in others. Faces in the bone lattice seemed to move, empty sockets widening, jaws working as if words wanted to be formed but could not find throats. The next barrage tore through that shimmer. The tower's top third broke away, shearing in a jagged line. For a heartbeat, it hung there, held by chains and connective matter. Then gravity claimed it. The whole section turned, a slow, nightmarish rotation before it crashed down into the plaza. The impact shook Antilasta's heart. Waves of bone dust roared outward, battering against the waiting Astartes. Chains snapped like struck wire. Fragments of skull and limb flew in all directions. For an instant, the world vanished into a choking white-grey cloud. In that cloud, things moved. Shapes, barely solid, lunged and twisted. Claws that were not claws scraped against ceramite. Fanged maws snapped inches from lenses. Whispered voices hissed in ears, promising salvation, threatening damnation, repeating words in languages that had never known a mortal throat. The warp did not give up its toys without protest. The Dreadwing met the manifestation with professional contempt. Bolters roared, their mass reactive rounds tearing apart any form substantial enough to present a target. Flamers washed curtains of promethium fire through the shifting vapors, their orange tongues burning away silhouettes that had never quite reached consistency. Librarians. At the edges of the formation raised witch staves and intoned warding phrases, their own presence in the warp, a hard, bright counterpoint to the mad whispers. To a mortal, it would have seemed as if the air itself were at war with them. To the legionaries, it was just another hazard to be catalogued and overcome. "Containment protocols," Redloss barked. "No one breaks the line. You see something that is not one of us, you kill it. If it still moves, you kill it again." Above the tumult, the lion stood unmoving. The psychic backwash clawed at him as well, of course. He felt the surge of resentment from the things that had been feeding on Zepeth's suffering. He heard their spite, their promises of power, their attempts at bargaining. None of it found purchase. He had wrestled with darker things than these. In the shadowed forests of his youth, he had looked upon nightmares that would have turned lesser men to statues. "You are not real," he told them quietly, not as a spell, but as a statement. "You are reactions, echoes. When the last man on this world forgets you, you will go out." The words had no effect on the warp, not in any measurable sense, but they ordered his own thoughts. They cut away any lingering temptation to assign too much significance to the screams. This was backlash, nothing more. The real work of evil had already been done, in the time taken to stack each of those bones and clean each of those skulls. Bit by bit, the cloud thinned. Fire and bolter shells and the sheer stubborn weight of the Astartes' presence pushed it back. The remaining segments of the tower continued to come down, under sustained artillery and the relentless drag of the grav haulers. Finally, with a last tortured crack of breaking structure, the foundation gave way. What had once been Antilasta's central symbol folded in on itself. Sections collapsed inward, smashing together, crushing the careful patterns into a hideous jumble, where there had been lines and angles meant to please unseen eyes. There was now only a mound of pulverized bone and twisted wire. The sigils cut into the plaza's stone around it were buried beneath the spill. Silence settled, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant, intermittent gunfire of other engagements in the wounded city. The apothecary stepped forward once more, running his scanners over the ruin. Whatever structure had allowed the tower to act as a focus was gone. The warp still bled through the world in many places, but this particular spear, driven into reality's flesh, had been yanked out. The wound would take time to close. It might never truly heal, but the bleeding had been slowed. Redloss turned to the lion, ash caking the plates of his armor, dust streaking the scars of his face. "The tower is destroyed," he said. "The immediate manifestations have been contained. We can begin detailed cleansing operations." The Primarch looked at the mound without satisfaction. "This is one symbol erased," he said. "There are others across this system, across Ultramar, across the whole burning galaxy. We will not catch them all, but we can make sure this one is remembered only as a cautionary tale by those who study the ruins." He glanced toward the darkened horizon, where other ritual sites still pulsed faintly on his mental map. "Farith," he said, "prepare eschaton-grade deployments. Phosphex, rad saturation, the full weight of the arsenal your wing carries. Not just here in Antilasta, across Zepath. We have seen what they have done with time and patience. We will answer with finality." Redloss bowed his head. There was no hesitation in him. "As you command, Lord, I will open the deepest vaults." "No more scalpel cuts," the lion continued. His gaze swept the dead city, the glassed scars, the distant smoke plumes. "No more attempts to excise only the worst and leave the rest to fester. This world has been made into a ritual object. We will break that object beyond repair." He turned away from the ruin of the tower, ash swirling around his boots. Behind him, the Dreadwing began to make ready for a different kind of campaign, one measured not in captured ground or liberated populations, but in how thoroughly a planet could be drowned in fire, so that nothing of what had grown there in the name of gods would ever stand up again. The Dreadwing exists for the moments when war stops being a means and becomes an end in itself. Most campaigns, even in the age of the Great Crusade, had objectives that could be written in the cold language of strategy: seize this orbital, capture that manufactory, break those regiments until they sign the compliance edicts and rebuild in the Imperium's image. For those purposes, the First Legion possessed more subtle tools, wings whose doctrines spoke of precision and restraint. But sometimes a Primarch looked upon a world and saw only a problem to be erased. Sometimes he judged that what had rooted there, in the soil and the souls and the very air, could not be allowed to exist in any form. Then the Eschaton imperative was spoken, and the Dreadwing opened their vaults. Under that old, dark oath, landscapes were rewritten. Mountains were turned to glass, seas boiled to vapor, continents raked with weapons usually reserved for final sanction from orbit. It was the point at which war tipped over into something else entirely, a wordless admission that a world was already dead, and all that remained was to decide how loudly it would scream on its way into the grave. Zepath had reached that point. The message that carried the proof came from the frigate Colgrevance, a lean hunter vessel that had been ranging ahead of the main fleet on the southern continent's orbital track. Its auger arrays had teeth like a predator's, and they had bitten into something, hiding beneath the cloud cover and scorched atmosphere. The Vox burst came through, into the Lion's Field command post as he stood over a hololithic representation of Antilasta's corpse. The bone tower was already gone from that projection, its symbols scrubbed away, but the scars it had left in the warp still flared as ugly stains. Officers and serfs moved in the half-shadow around him, relaying casualty reports, updating the positions of scattered enemy remnants. "Transmission from Colgrevance," the communications officer announced, dropping to one knee as he held out the data slate. "Priority classification. Command eyes." Lionel Johnson took the device without ceremony, eyes flicking over the runes as they scrolled. Auger readings, energy spikes that did not match any known pattern for conventional power plants. Plotted coordinates along the southern landmass, where a fortress complex had dug its heels into the earth. An image blinked up, ghosted by interference. A cluster of towers, their silhouettes jagged and ugly, linked by curtain walls and bastions that bristled with weapon emplacements. Over and around it lay a shimmering dome of force, a shield whose edges flickered with colors no sane spectrum acknowledged. Along those edges, tiny detonations marked the spots where Thunderhawk gunships had dared to test their mettle and been repulsed with punishing fire. Thunderhawk Patrol Alpha reports sustained fire from fortress batteries. The attached note read, "Unknown warp-tainted emissions from the central keep. Enemy presence confirmed as combined Wordbearer and World Eater contingent. Recommend designation as primary target." The Lion passed the slate to Farith Redloss, who had come at once when the message arrived. The Dreadwing commander read with the same steady focus, his scarred face tightening as he traced the outlines of the fortress with one calloused finger. "They made themselves a heart," he said. "We have destroyed one of the limbs in Antilasta, but this is where the blood pumps from. Ritual. Command and control. Summoning chambers, Vox nodes to direct their cults, broadcasts to the scattered serf cadres and the auxilia they have captured or broken." "Cut this," the Lion said softly, "and the rest of the infection goes slack." He straightened, looking at the fortress icon, where it pulsed on the main hololith. It sat amid a blasted plain, ragged mountain ranges to one side, blackened forest remnants to the other. Gun emplacements studded every elevation. The shield shimmered like heated glass above it, warping the auger returns. "We do not have time for a conventional siege," he went on. "Every hour they hold that place, they continue their rites. The tower in Antilasta was a conduit, but this is the altar. This is where they speak to their gods. We will shut their mouths." "What are your orders?" Redloss asked, though he already knew the shape of the answer. He could feel it in the weight of the word eschaton hanging between them, in the way the Lion's eyes had hardened since they first set foot on this cursed world. "Open the deepest vaults," the Primarch said. "Muster the Dreadwing in full strength. We will strike the fortress with everything you possess that should never be used on any world we intend to keep." Redloss bowed, fist to breastplate. There was no hesitation. The Dreadwing had not been bred for doubt. It took time to draw 1,500 specialists from their various tasks across Zepath, but not much. The signal that called them in carried a weight that had not been invoked in many years. Companies broke off from cleansing operations, leaving lesser forces to mop up cultist remnants. Columns that had been scouring the outskirts of other cities altered course without complaint. On the shattered plain north of the target fortress, an armored park grew. Spartans, their hulls thick as bunker walls, idled in rows. Land raiders of multiple configurations, from standard assault variants to rare old patterns whose machine spirits remembered battles from the earliest days of the Crusade, rumbled into position. Mastodon heavy transports, low and brutish, hunched over like armored beasts awaiting the goad. Felglaves, their massive neutron blasters silent for now, sat like coiled lightning, their crews performing rites over their weapons with an almost reverent dread. Around and between these steel leviathans moved their masters, dreadwing legionaries in their dark plate, squad markings picked out in red and bone, checked plasma burners and loaded phosphex canisters into racks. Rad grenades were counted and blessed, seals checked on containers filled with things that should never see open air. Warp blasting ordnance, stolen from forgotten arsenals and bound in layers of wards, was slotted into launchers whose names had been struck from most records. 1,500 brothers. Not many, measured against the wars of that age, where entire worlds were garrisoned by millions. But each of these was a veteran of horrors that would have broken whole armies. Each carried weapons that could erase entire districts in a single bitter breath. When their preparations were complete, a storm bird descended among them. It came down on a column of fire, engines beating the fouled sky into submission. Dust and scrap whirled, cloak-like, around its hull as it settled on landing claws that crushed fractured rock. The ramp clanged down, and the lion walked out into the armored forest. He did not stand above them on some raised dais. He took his place beside the lead Spartan, cloak snapping in the wind, his helm clipped to his belt so that his sons could see his face. The Dreadwing formed up around him in a ragged half-circle, the dull gleam of their armor turning toward their Primarch, like a field of dark iron flowers tilting toward a cold sun. There were no banners, no war horns, no theatrics, only a murmur that became a growl as the Dreadwing took up the words that had been passed down their order since its inception. No songs, they said, voices merging through vox and open air alike. No honors, only the task. We are the ending that is sent when all else has failed. The phrase had taken many forms over the years. Sometimes it had been longer, weighed down with scriptural additions. Sometimes shorter, boiled down to a single brutal sentiment. Here, now, it was stripped to its barest bones. The lion listened, head inclined slightly, as if measuring the cadence. It pleased him. It was the kind of creed that did not lie, that did not promise glory or absolution. It promised only work and an end. He raised his blade in acknowledgement, the weapon's edge catching what little light broke through the clouds. "Mount up," he said. "The gods you're about to meet are not yours. You owe them nothing. Give them nothing. Take from them everything they have built here." Engines roared in answer. Ramp locks slammed. The armored column began to move. As the Dreadwing advanced across the southern continent's scarred skin, the void above them shifted. The battleship Intolerant, one of the oldest warships still serving in the 1st Legion's fleet, adjusted her orbit. Her spine realigned along the axis of the enemy fortress. Her gunnery decks, ancient and sanctified, swung inward. Annihilator pattern weapons, monstrous lance arrays and macro cannon whose shells could pierce the heart of a hive city, drew power. On her bridge, gunners and tech adepts intoned ancient firing canticles. Targeting cogitators chattered as they tried to account for the flickering interference thrown up by the fortress's shields and the warped taint that bled from its highest towers. Vox Lynx carried the Lion's authorization like a spark. "Begin fire missions," came the command. The first salvo fell from orbit, like the wrath of a blind god. Beams of concentrated energy tore down, spearing through cloud and turbulence. Where they struck the ground short of the fortress. They scooped out trenches kilometers long, vaporizing rock and soil, and whatever unfortunate life still clung there. Macro shells followed, their descent slower but no less inevitable. Each impact throwing up fountains of stone and molten glass that rose higher than hab spires and fell in lethal rain. Around the fortress, the plain became a churning sea of explosions. Defensive emplacements dug into the outer approaches vanished in chains of detonations. Bunkers that might have stood against conventional bombardment for days or weeks were crushed in moments, their armored roofs collapsing like paper under the hammer blows. Inside the fortress, the word-bearers watched from firing slits and crenellations as the world beyond their walls was torn apart. The World-Eaters laughed, pacing along the ramparts like caged beasts, eager for any assault that would dare to come through that hell. Cultists and broken auxilia cowered in tunnels and vaults, praying to any power that might hear them. Through it all, the shield held. It was a dome of sickly light, its surface writhing like the skin of a diseased animal. Each lance strike that touched it flared bright, bleeding color into the air. Rumbling shockwaves rolled around its curve, seeking weakness, but finding none. Warp energy, drawn from the rituals being enacted in the fortress's central chambers, fed the generator cores that sustained the barrier. Every screaming life in the cells below became another heartbeat for the shield. Redloss watched the spectacle from the command cupola of his Spartan, its armored roof hatch open so he could see the sky. The ground shook under the weight of the orbital fire, sending tremors through the hull. Dust clouds rolled across the plain, occasionally swallowing the column in opaque waves before thinning again. Impressive, he conceded. In its way. Impressive, the Lion agreed over the command channel, and irrelevant if we burn the entire area long enough. Time, Redloss said. That is what we lack. Every hour we pour fire into that shell is another hour their rites continue. The tower in Antihilate was a satellite. This is the true node. If we grind away slowly here, we may yet win the ground and lose the war this place is intended to fight. There was a pause. Through the link, the Lion's voice came back as cold iron. Then we will not grind, he said. We will break. Eschaton level. Even spoken without emphasis, the phrase carried weight. The command channel went momentarily quiet as its meaning sank in. The Dreadwing had known, from the moment they were called, that this was a possibility. Now it was explicit. Orbit, the Lion continued, switching channels with a thought. Intolerant, acknowledge. Intolerant receives, came the reply, the shipmaster's voice flat, its ritual politeness thin over the tension. You have seen our opening. Volleys, Lord. The shield stands still. It will continue to stand while you use weapons that leave anything recognizable behind, the Lion said. Escalate. Phosphex saturations on all approaches outside the shield's perimeter. Radwave strikes on the outer bastions. You will consider any life within those zones forfeit. Any survivors will not remain so for long. There was no protest. Those who served under a Primarch in those days knew the cost of obedience. Warnings were for men who hoped to bargain with fate. Here there was only the line and the decision to cross it. As you decree, the shipmaster said quietly. Preparing payloads now. On Intolerant's lower decks, new sections of the arsenal opened. Phosphex canisters, sealed in triple-locked cradles, were winched into place. Their glassy cores contained a sludge of pale, malicious fire, bound by chemical and sorcerous means, eager to flow and cling and burn in ways that common flame could not emulate. Rad warheads, their containment fields humming, were loaded into missile racks, each one a promise of invisible murder that would echo long after the blast wave had passed. The next wave of ordnance fell. Where Phosphex bombs burst, the world changed. Green-white fire spilled out in thick, crawling sheets, flowing across the blasted plain like liquid that did not care for gravity. It ran up the sides of wrecked bunkers and along trenches, seeping into cracks, finding hiding places and burning them clean. Anything caught by it became silhouette and shadow for a moment, outlined in light before crumbling to char. The fire clung to stone and steel long after organic matter was gone, eating and eating until it finally gutted out under its own exhaustion. Rad warheads blossomed in cold, pale flashes. The shockwaves they threw were less dramatic than those of high-explosive shells, but the air itself shuddered. The ground seemed to recoil. Invisible tides rolled outward, washing over anything that still lived in the outer bastions, soaking into soil and bone and blood. Men who might have survived the initial blast felt nausea and burning and a deep marrow-level ache that no armor could stop. Those who did not die outright in the hours that followed carried death seeds in their flesh that would flower in agonizing ways. From his vantage atop the Spartan, Redlos watched the plane convert into a nightmare. Fire crawled in great tongues between the jagged outcrops, painting the shield in reflections of sickly light. Rad storms began to rise. Columns of dust shot through with faint, eerie glows, dancing across the torn ground like ghostly tornadoes. Sections of terrain simply collapsed as underground installations cooked and caved in, leaving yawning chasms into which burning debris tumbled. Within the fortress, alarms howled. The shield flared brighter, drawing more and more power from the screaming pits below. In the ritual chambers, word-bearer, priests raised their hands to the shaking ceiling, chanting louder, their voices ragged. World-Eater champions laughed, because this was what they loved, the feeling of the world trying to kill them back. They did not see this as defeat. To them, the fact that the loyal Imperium had been forced to such measures was a kind of victory. They whispered that the gods must be pleased if their enemies were willing to poison their own future just to scratch this one cancer. "Look at them," one dark apostle crooned, listening to the thunder outside. "They burn this world for us. Their Primarch does our work. Every screaming soul, every blistered field, every poisoned well is another line in the scripture we have written here." His words were swallowed by the roar of detonations and the crackle of the shield. For the lion, there was no triumph in what he had ordered, only necessity. He watched the distant firestorms from the command display in his own transport, jaw set. "They will talk of this as our atrocity," he said quietly, perhaps to Redlos, perhaps to himself. "They will forget that the first sin was committed when this fortress was raised and the tower in Antihilate was stacked. I am content with that. Let history misplace blame, so long as the infection ends here." "If there is history," Redlos replied, his tone respectful, but without softness, "it will be because decisions like this were made, or so I choose to believe, or the work becomes too heavy to carry." The Primarch's eyes flickered toward him, assessing, then returned to the burning plain. The Dreadwing column closed in as far as it dared, stopping at the edge of the worst phosphex flows. Even Astartes' armor could not weather that fire. They formed up in assault wedges, tanks nose to nose, ready to drive into whatever breach appeared. Inside the fortress, the defenders braced, their own artillery firing impotently into the boiling sea outside their walls, shells detonating in rad-charged dust and phosphex banks. The shield trembled. Under the unrelenting assault, even its warp-fed generators began to falter. The energies within it flickered. Sections grew thin, guttering like candle flames in a storm. For the first time, stray shells slipped through, hammering into the outer curtain wall. Gun towers toppled. Sections of parapet collapsed, taking cultists and traitor serfs with them. "Now," the Lion said. His signal raced up through the command chain, into the vox nets of waiting pilots. High above the plane, 4 Caestus assault rams broke formation with their escort fighters and dove, They were brutal craft, their hulls shaped like the heads of battering rams, reinforced prow plates, and melter charges built into their very bones. Their engines howled as they knifed through the fouled atmosphere, contrails trailing behind them like the tails of hunting comets. Phosphex fire licked at their stub wings. Rad haze shimmered around their hulls. They drove on, hugging trajectories calculated to thread the thinning gaps in the shield. Warning runes flared across their cockpits as systems complained about the abuse. Pilots muttered curses and prayers, hands white-knuckled on controls. The first Caestus hit the shield at a point where it had just gutted, its prow plunging through residual energy like a blade through thin ice. For an instant, light and force wrapped around it, crawling along its frame. Then it was through, scorched but intact, hurtling toward the fortress wall. The others followed in its wake, each taking advantage of the rip it left. To those watching from outside, the moments that followed were almost beautiful. 4 streaks of dark metal, arrowing in through a world of green fire and sick light. 4 impacts along the curtain wall, each one a blossom of orange and black as melter charges blew. Stonecrete and heretically reinforced ceramite vaporized. Shockwaves rippled along the battlements. Sections of wall simply ceased to exist, turning into gaping wounds that opened the fortress's innards to the poisoned air. The Caestus hulls, built to survive such carnage, smashed through into the spaces beyond, their ramps already opening before they fully came to rest. Dreadwing legionaries poured out, bolters raised, plasma burners primed, rad grenades hanging heavy from their belts. Behind them, engines roaring, the first Spartans and land raiders surged forward. Treads grinding over ground turned to blackened glass, driving straight into the man-made hell they themselves had created. The eschaton imperative had been invoked. Now it would be carried out at the muzzle of a gun. Within the First Legion, there were orders that other brothers spoke of with something like pride, or at least open respect. The Raven Wing, masters of rapid strike and reconnaissance. The Death Wing, bulwark against the worst horrors the galaxy could throw at the Imperium. These were names that drew. Nods in strategia, the kind of nods given to craftsmen whose work was dangerous but necessary. The Dreadwing drew a different reaction. Even among their own legion, they walked in a kind of isolation. They were the brothers who volunteered for duties that should never have needed to exist. They were given the keys to vaults that the Emperor himself had ordered sealed and told, "This is yours now. Keep it. Use it only when you are told, and be prepared to burn with it if it escapes your control." They specialized in massacre, not as frenzy or indulgence, but as an ugly science. They knew the yields of weapons that erased bloodlines, and they remembered the faces of worlds whose names would never be spoken again because of their hand. Allies feared them. Enemies feared them. Many of their own brothers avoided their company when they could. Dreadwing warriors did not take offense at this. They understood. They did not particularly like themselves either. Inside the southern fortress, on Zepath, they lived up to that reputation. The Kestus rams had torn open the curtain wall. The breach still smoked, edges of stonecrete and ceramite glowing dull red where melter charges had eaten them. The world beyond the gap was chaos, collapsed galleries, shattered firing positions, bodies thrown aside like discarded tools. Smoke hung thick, tinged with the sour bite of radwash and the chemical reek of exotic ordnance. Farith Redloss pushed through it, leading his interemptors. The interemptors were the Dreadwing's favored scalpel, if such a word could be used for anything they carried. Their plasma burners hung beneath their forearms, bulky weapons that hissed in anticipation, coils glowing a hungry blue-white. They moved in 2 files, armor scorched and splashed with the residue of the phosphex storms outside, helm lenses cutting through the murk. The first traitor serfs they encountered did not even realize the fortress had been breached. They were scrambling at an ammunition hoist in a side corridor, trying to clear a jam, shouting at one another over the din. Their uniforms were half torn, weapons slung, attention entirely on the feed system that refused to obey them. One looked up as the Astartes rounded the corner. His mouth opened, perhaps to shout an alarm, perhaps to beg. Redlos lifted his hand a fraction. The interemptors fired as one. Plasma washed down the passage in overlapping cones of white light. The heat was immense, sucking oxygen from the air, turning the scream that began in mortal throats into a soundless contortion. Flesh and cloth and cheap armor evaporated against it. In a heartbeat, there was nothing left of the traitor serfs but smears of vitrified residue on the walls and a few flakes drifting down like snow. "No bodies," one of the interemptors said over the squad vox, checking his weapons readouts. "No martyrs." "Exactly," Redlos replied. "We do not leave icons for their gods to touch." They advanced deeper. The fortress interior was a maze of corridors and galleries, some hewn from rock, others built from prefab segments hauled from distant forges. The word-bearers had corrupted it in workmanlike fashion. Symbols were etched into bulkheads, their strokes burned deep by cutter torches. Shrines had been raised in alcoves, where once there might have been weapon lockers or cogitator banks. Here and there, candles guttered, their flames guttering in draughts, stirred by the passage of armored giants. The deeper they went, the thicker the smoke became. Fire licked along ceiling supports, fed by broken fuel lines. The floor jolted at intervals under the impact of orbital fire, still walking across the fortress roof. Dust and fragments of stone showered down. At a wide junction, the interemptors ran into the first organized resistance. The passage opened into a hall that might once have served as a mustering chamber. Now its far end had been reinforced with slabs of armor. Plate and debris, welded and fused into an ad hoc bastion. Demon faces leered from the metal, carved and painted, and in some awful cases, moving just enough that it was impossible to dismiss as an illusion. Behind those bulkheads, word-bearers waited, armor red and black, bolters and heavier weapons trained down the kill lane. They announced themselves not with gunfire, but with words. A dark apostle's voice rolled out from behind the barricade, carried by vox amplifiers and whatever other tricks his patrons had gifted him. It was rich and deep, the kind of voice that might once have filled cathedrals and brought congregations to their knees. Now it spoke of failure and guilt. "Children of the lie," it intoned, "you come here in your father's name, bearing his tools, thinking your hands are clean. Every step you take on this world, every life you burn, every drop of blood you spill, is added to the ledger you claim to hate. Look upon what we have done with your emperor's work. We have taken the cities he built and turned them into true temples. We have taken his design for men and shown them what it is to be more than cattle." The words seeped into the hall, threading through the smoke. To mortal ears, they would have been poison. Each phrase crafted to prick at doubt, to dig fingers into old scars. It was not mere propaganda. There were subtle pushes in it, tiny directed pulses of warp pressure that sought for weak spots in the mind. The Dreadwing advanced without a word. Redlos signaled, and his interemptors broke into two teams, hugging opposite walls. Bolter fire spat from the word-bearer position, explosive shells hammering into the floor and walls, throwing up shards. One dark angel took a round square in the chest. His mass helped where a mortal's fragile body would have simply come apart. Even so, the impact dented armor and drove him to one knee. He rose without complaint, burn marks black across his plate, and kept moving. The sermon rose in pitch, the apostle sensing resistance and pushing harder. "You know what your Primarch has decreed," he thundered. "You have seen the fires he has called down. Do you truly think you are different from us? You make eschatons. We make scripture. The only difference is that we are honest about the gods we serve." Redlos did not bother to reply. The word-bearers wanted an argument. They wanted to weave doubt into the fight, to sap the conviction of their attackers. The Dreadwing answered instead with plasma. At his gesture, The lead rank of interemptors stepped into the open and fired together. Beams of incandescent energy knifed through the smog, punching into the demon-etched barricade. Metal ran like wax. Runes burned out, their colors flaring and then dying. One corpulent demon face carved into a slab, contorted in sudden, very real agony before the plasma washed over it and turned it into slag. Bolter fire faltered as the word-bearers scrambled to adjust, their cover disappearing in chunks. They began to switch targets, aiming for the exposed interemptors. It was too late. The Dreadwing's second rank stepped out, overlapping their fire, and a tide of annihilating heat poured into the defenders' position. Armor blackened and melted, red plates split, lenses cracked. The Apostle's voice turned from thunderous accusation to a wordless roar as his followers died around him, some in mid-chant, hands still raised in supplication to the gods who were not going to save them from physics. Within heartbeats, the barricade was a molten, sagging ruin. Bodies burned within it, reduced to unrecognizable, shriveled forms. No careful corpse could be retrieved from that wreckage. No neat martyr pose could be arranged. The Dark Apostle himself staggered into view, armor glowing, flesh beneath charred. He tried to raise his staff. Redloss shot him in the head with a single bolter round. The missile detonated, and whatever remained of the man vanished into the collapsing mass. "Move," Redloss said. "We are not here to admire our work." They pushed through the smoking breach and into the deeper arteries of the fortress. It was hotter there, closer to the core of the structure. Heat shimmered in the air, bending light. The walls sweated condensed moisture and blood in equal measure. Floors slicked with things better not considered caught at armored boots. Redloss marked the increased humidity and the rising temperature and turned toward the direction he knew would lead down. "Engine spaces," he said, and holding pens. "They are always close in places like this." They found the dreadnoughts first. The chamber was vast, carved into the bedrock, support columns rising like petrified trees. Chains hung from the ceiling, thick as a man's thigh, swaying with the distant impacts of bombardment. In the center stood three hulking forms, hunched within their restraints. World Eater. Dreadnoughts were obscene things even by the standards of their kind. The living core entombed within each sarcophagus had long ago surrendered any right to dignity. The caskets bulged with cabling and crude armor additions, trophies welded on, skulls impaled. Their legs and arms were over-muscled with extra plating and reinforcement, clawed feet sunk into the stone by years of stamping. They strained against their chains as the dark angels entered, metal links creaking, servos whining. They had been penned here like attack dogs, waiting for some signal to release them into the corridors. Two still hung motionless, systems in low wake mode, the flicker of runes across their sarcophagi, the only sign of flaring machine spirits and the broken minds within. The third was already awake. Its eye lenses burned a murderous red. The front of its sarcophagus was scarred with fresh impacts and gouges, as if it had already smashed itself against something recently. The chains that held it were taut, dragging deep grooves in the stone floor, where the dreadnought had lunged to the limits of its leash again and again. It saw the green armor, the winged sword sigils, and bellowed. The sound was a metallic howl that made dust leap from the ceiling. "Release," Redloss said. His brothers cut the chains with melter charges, blowing the tensioned links apart in gouts of white fire. The dreadnought lurched forward, stumbling as the sudden lack of resistance threw off its balance. Then it found its footing and charged. The first thing it hit was a support pillar. It did not seem to care. Its claws tore into the stone, leaving gouges. A plasma beam from an interemptor's burner flashed across its flank, leaving a glowing scar. It roared again, louder, and hurled itself at the nearest Dark Angel. Redloss met it, stepping in. He was not the biggest warrior in the Legion, nor the strongest, but he was very good at killing things that should not be able to die easily. His axe was an ancient pattern, the blade etched with runes whose meanings had been lost even to the librarius. Its edge glowed faintly, not with heat, but with a controlled distortion of reality that allowed it to bite where other weapons might skitter off ceramite. The dreadnought swung a power fist the size of a coffin. Redloss stepped inside the ark, boots skidding for a heartbeat on the blood-slick floor, then finding purchase. The fist missed him by the breadth of a hand, pulverizing the stone where he had stood. The Dark Angel's axe came up in a tight, brutal arc, burying itself in the joint between sarcophagus and shoulder. Sparks flared, armor buckled. The dreadnought lurched, one arm suddenly less responsive. It tried to retaliate, swinging back with its other limb. Redloss tore the axe free in a spray of fragments and struck again, lower this time, into the joint of the leg. There was no elegant dance, no exchange of elaborate blows. He hacked at the points that mattered, again and again, bracing his stance, teeth bared in effort, until something deep in the engine structure gave with a tearing shriek. The dreadnought crashed down onto one knee, then toppled, its weight shaking the chamber. Pinned on its side, it thrashed, claw still clawing at empty air. Warp-tainted machine spirits howled in its frame. Redloss stepped up onto its hull, boots denting plating, and drove the axe down into the core of the sarcophagus. Once, twice. With the third blow, the howling cut off, replaced by a series of pops and hisses as internal systems failed. He left the weapon embedded for a moment, catching his breath. Then he yanked it free, goreless but slick with coolant and oil, and stepped down. "Finish the others," he said. "Do not leave any of these things for some future commander to discover and think he can redeem." The interemptors obliged, walking up to the still-chained dreadnoughts and putting sustained plasma bursts into their core housings until their runes died. Further in, closer to the fortress's pulsing heart, the true obscenity waited. The engine chamber was a womb of machinery. Conduits ran like steel arteries along the walls and ceiling, feeding into a central mass of pistons and rotating elements that throbbed with awful rhythm. Warp light bled from gaps in its casing, the glow not so much illuminating as staining the air. Around its base were the pens. They had once been holding cells, built to contain criminals or prisoners of war. The word-bearers had repurposed them as fuel. Men filled them, not corpses, living men. They were wired into the machinery by hook and clamp, not in the crudely surgical way one might find in a mechanicum generatorium, but in a manner that spoke of half-understanding and vicious intent. Cables wrapped around limbs, needles pierced flesh at random. Some prisoners hung half-suspended, feet barely touching the ground. Others were pressed against the bars, faces grey, eyes wide, and staring. They did not scream, not in any way that could be heard with mortal ears. Their mouths moved, some in silent prayers, some in hoarse, wordless sobs. The noise they made that mattered was somewhere else, in the warp, a constant grinding note of terror and pain that fed the engines above them. The lion stood in the entryway, looking at the tableau. Redloss and his warriors halted behind him, suddenly feeling their heavy armor as if it were a burden rather than a shell. "Emperor, preserve us," one of the mortal auxilia whispered. He had come this far by some cruel luck, attached as a guide, his rifle long since empty, his eyes now fixed on those pens. The Primarch's face did not change. If what he felt at the sight of the prisoners registered at all, it did so only as a tightening around the eyes. "This is what their shield eats," he said. "This is what held against our first blows. Not generators, not capacitors, men. Can we free them?" The auxiliar blurted, then flinched at his own temerity. Redloss glanced at the engine core. He could feel the warp pressure radiating from it, like heat from a forge. He imagined, just for a moment, what would happen if these men were pulled out without care. The snarl of alien energy clawing for new purchase. The inevitable surge as the system tried to compensate. The contagious chaos that might spill out into the already wounded world. The lions spared the thought no more time than it took to reject it. "No," he said, "we cannot. The connection is too deep. They are not simply attached to these engines. They are part of them now. To unmake that would mean inviting whatever has its claws sunk in here to reach out in another way." He drew his pistol. It was a massive weapon, a relic of the Great Crusade, its casing etched with old script. He did not seem to take any particular pleasure or pain in what he did next. "Make it quick," he said. "Use gunfire and rad pulses. Do not let them linger." The auxiliar paled. The Dreadwing nodded. There was no discussion of options, no weighing of moral possibility, only the arithmetic of threat and the cleanest solution available. Some of the prisoners saw what was coming and began to cry out, hands reaching toward the approaching Astartes. Others sagged in their restraints, faces easing as if some part of them had already left. One man, his eyes glassy, managed to speak. "Thank you," he whispered. Plasma and bolt and rad washed through the pens. The engine faltered, its warp song stuttering as its fuel was removed in a way it had not been designed to handle. The light bleeding from its seams flickered. For a moment, the pressure in the chamber rose, a spike that made every skull ache. Then it dropped, all at once, like a held breath being released. The warp presence recoiled, denied further purchase. The engine shuddered and sank into sullen silence, internal components grinding to a halt. Next to one of the pens, a man huddled in the shadow of the bars. He wore the ragged remnants of an administratum robe over a stained uniform. A pict slung at his chest hung cracked and dead, its lens spider-webbed. Ink stains marked his fingers. He had not been chained like the others. He had been forced to watch. He stared at the dark angels through eyes that had seen too much and struggled to fit it into words. A remembrancer once, a scribe attached to an auxiliar command, someone who had thought he understood war because he had filled folios with descriptions of it. He watched the Dreadwing move among the dead, checking for any sign of lingering life and ending it. He saw the Primarch holster his weapon without a flicker of expression. He felt something in himself shift. In his later accounts, he would try to explain it. He would write that the word-bearers were monsters of belief, and the World-Eaters monsters of impulse. But the dark angels who walked through that fortress were monsters of purpose. They acted with a coldness that made the frenzy of the traitors almost human by comparison. They did not enjoy what they did. They did not revel. They did not gloat. They simply calculated, chose, and killed. He would admit that he found no comfort in that distinction. The Dreadwing pushed onward, up from the engine levels toward the secondary citadel. The higher they climbed, the more the fortress rebelled against their presence. Corridors lengthened and shortened unpredictably. A passage that had taken 10 steady strides before now stretched to 50, or snapped to 3, depending on the moment. Doorways led to places that could not occupy the same physical space. A stairwell ended where it should not, opening into a void that had no clear dimensions. Reality bent under the pressure of the rites underway near the summit. The word-bearers had carved their fortress into more than stone. They had gouged it into the membrane between worlds itself. Redloss felt it in the uneasy flicker of his helm displays, in the way his internal chronometer stuttered. Seconds became elastic. Sound lagged behind sight by a fraction more than it should. "Ritual is nearing culmination," one of the attached librarians said, his voice strained as he leaned on his staff. "If they complete it, this place will not merely be tainted, it will be folded." "Folded?" Redloss asked. "Into the storm," the Psyker said. Zepath will cease to be a world in any sense we understand. It will become a feature of the ruin storm, a cancerous node in the warp. We will not be able to reach it again by any means short of madness, and it will bleed corruption into whatever lies around it until the end of things. Redlos looked up, as if he could see through the stone to the shrines and altar chambers above. Then, we are almost out of time, he said. We have broken their tower in Antihilate. We have gutted their shield engines. But as long as that ritual continues, this remains a heart that can pump rot into the galaxy. He opened a Vox channel to orbit. Intolerant, he said. This is Farith Redlos. I require a surgical strike. Static crackled. Then the shipmaster's voice came through, steadier than it had any right to be given the interference. Intolerant hears you, he said. You have our fire. Name your target. Redlos gestured, and a servo skull flitted forward, its optical arrays whirring as it scanned the corridor junction ahead. Auspex readings translated into abstract coordinate data. The librarian muttered, adding his own adjustments based on warp flux he could feel. The fortress shield generator complex sits beneath the secondary citadel, Redlos said. It still draws on the lingering flows from the engines we have just silenced, but something else feeds it now, something higher. I can get our men within striking distance, but not inside. The geometry is unreliable. Unreliable geometry makes for uncertain targeting, the shipmaster replied. You are asking me to drop a blade through a fog and trust that it finds the right throat and not yours. That is why we are the Dreadwing, Redlos said. We stand close enough to guide the strike and accept that some of us will be in the path when it lands. There was a moment of silence that might, in another time, have held argument. Not here. Transmit coordinates, Intolerant said. We will ready the warp lance. The device in question was more than a simple lance battery. It was a weapon modified in those early, desperate years of the heresy. Its beam tuned not merely to burn through matter, but to disrupt the fabric of the warp, where it touched real space. It was dangerous even to use. A misaligned shot could do as much harm to the firing ship as to the target. Few commanders would willingly employ it at such close association with their own ground forces. Redlos sent the data. He and his warriors moved, pushing up through another few levels until they reached the outer corridors of the shield generator complex. Runes burned on the walls here, bright and hungry. The air hummed with restrained force. Word-bearers held the access points, chanting, their voices raw. The Dreadwing hit them with plasma and bolter and did not stop until the last traitor fell. They did not push into the generator heart itself. To do so would have been to step into the center of the eventual impact. Instead, Redlos drew his line like a noose just outside. Marking boundary, he told Intolerant. If your beam falls short, the generator will stand. If it goes long, the Citadel will vanish and take us with it. Aim as you would if your Primarch were watching. He is, the shipmaster said, always. On the battleship's lance decks, rituals began. Tech adepts chanted, slitting their own palms to anoint the weapon housings with blood mixed with sacred oils. Machine spirits, already frayed by the demands of ongoing bombardment, were coaxed and threatened in equal measure into accepting new command strings. The warp lance's emitter arrays swiveled, aligning on a single, precise point buried deep in stone and flux. Stand by, Redlos said to his own men. Brace for impact. Any who live through this, advance immediately and finish whatever still moves. He did not speak of those who did not live through it. The Dreadwing did not need to hear that part. There was no visible sign from the ground when the weapon fired, no descending beam, no dramatic spear of light. One moment, the oppressive weight of warp-charged power pressed down from above, making ears ring and teeth ache. The next, a point somewhere just ahead of Redlos became impossible. There are no good words in any human language for what a weapon like that does. It did not simply burn, It removed. Space twisted inward, collapsing. Sound vanished for a heartbeat. Armor plates buckled as pressure fluctuated. Men fell to one knee, choking on nothing. The generator complex, with its banks of demonic machinery and its webs of cabling, ceased to be in the way a nightmare ceases when the dreamer wakes. Then the world snapped back. A shockwave rolled out from the absent point, carrying fragments of machinery and stone with it. The corridor bucked. Walls cracked. Sections of ceiling fell. Redloss threw himself forward, using his bulk to shield the librarian beside him. Two of his warriors were not quite far enough from the collapsing edge. One vanished into a newly formed chasm without a sound. The other had his lower body crushed under falling masonry. He saw Redloss look his way, saw the fractional pause, and nodded once. A bolter shot ended him before the dust had even settled. Above, the fortress shield screamed. The dome of light that had held against orbital fire for so long flickered wildly, its surface crawling with fractures. One section imploded entirely, collapsing inward. Another bulged, thinning, until it burst like an overstressed membrane. Warp energy leaked in pale threads that dissolved in the poisoned air. The remaining segments tried to compensate, overloading the systems that fed them. In the span of a few heartbeats, the shield failed. From orbit, Intolerance gunners saw it vanish from their auger displays, the hazy distortion gone, leaving bare stone and metal exposed. Firing solutions updated automatically. Targets that had been off-limits became fair game. Shield collapse confirmed, the shipmaster said. All batteries, focus fire on the secondary citadel, and any remaining heavy emplacements. The Primarch has his gap. Inside the fortress, dust still drifting in slow curtains, Redloss hauled himself up. He spat blood, though he did not remember biting his tongue, and checked his armor seals. They held. His axe was still in his hand. Around him, Dreadwing survivors were already moving, stepping over rubble, weapons raised. "Forward," he growled, "while they are reeling." They surged into the space where the generator complex had been, boots striking shattered conduits and the edges of a crater whose depth could not be properly measured. The warp pressure in the air was lower now, its prior intensity reduced to an ugly background hum. Ahead, stairwells led up toward the secondary citadel's inner halls, where the chief word-bearers and their chosen butchers would be gathering for a last stand. Far above, the bombardment changed tone. With the shield gone, orbital fire hit the fortress proper. Towers exploded in chains of sympathetic detonations. Gun emplacements vanished under sustained lance strikes. Whole sections of the upper structure sloughed away, crashing down in avalanches of debris. Through one of the growing breaches in the citadel's walls, a dark shape descended. It came on wings of fire, shouldering aside smoke. Stormbird. Engines howled as the craft flared for landing atop what had once been a ritual terrace. The ramp dropped even before the landing struts had fully locked. Lionel Johnson stepped out into the ruin, blade in hand, his cloak snapping in the storm of dust and ash. Behind him, his chosen retinue followed, green armor catching the glare of distant fires. The fortress was no longer protected by its sorceries or its shield. It lay open, wounded, ready for the final cut. The First Legion's hardest killers were already in its veins. Their Primarch had come to the heart. On the field, the sons of the Emperor were each their own kind of storm. Angron descended like a chain axe given flesh, a gale of rage that tore apart the line by sheer force of impact. To see him was to watch a natural disaster in armor, inevitable and mindless. Sanguinius fell like a star, wings outspread, the terrible beauty of him as much a weapon as the sword he carried, breaking armies with the awful certainty that they stood before something holy. Lionel Johnson was neither. He did not radiate the wild fury of Angron, nor the theatrical splendor of Sanguinius. When he went to war, he did so as a hunter, whose patience had simply reached its end. In him, there was no wasted motion, no indulgence, no revelation, only a line drawn through the chaos, straight and cold, cutting from problem to solution with the inevitability of a blade following its own edge. To walk beside him in battle was to feel that all things had been reduced to calculus, vectors, ranges, force, required expenditure. To stand against him was to discover you had been an equation all along, and that he had just reached its answer. The Stormbird's hull still throbbed with the heat of re-entry when it struck the fortress. It came in low over the outer bastions, past towers already gutted by lance fire, through a sky thick with dust and the incandescent tails of falling debris. Its engines roared, gouging a path through the smoke. Under its prow, the terrace that crowned the inner sanctum rushed up. Stone cracked as landing claws bit deep, the impact shuddering through chambers beneath. Before the ramp had fully slammed down, the lion was moving. He strode into a world of flickering light and falling ash, his cloak snapping in the updrafts. Around him came his chosen retinue, elite dark angels, whose armor bore the scars of enough campaigns that their heraldry was only partially visible beneath the history. They formed on him without need for orders, shields and blades and bolters, angling outward in a seamless pattern. The terrace had once been a place of contemplation. Its stone flags were etched with old imperial sigils, half buried now under the crawling script of the new faith. At its far end, wide doors yawned open, their frames warped by blast and heat. Beyond lay the inner sanctum. The last of the fortress's elite defenders met them there, World Eater veterans, their white and blue. Armor, drowned in dried gore, held the doorway with chain axes and heavy weapons. Word-bearer chosen stood beside them, crimson plate overlaid with parchment strips and hanging script, bolters locked into firing lines. They had arrayed themselves in the classic fashion, a bulwark of superhuman bodies and overlapping fields of fire, designed to slow any assault long enough for the rites behind them to reach conclusion. The lion did not slow. He moved forward at a walk that felt almost lazy. The first salvo of bolt shells hit his guard, exploding against layered ceramite and refractor fields. A few rounds came close enough to scar his own armor, leaving black kisses on green and gold. His retinue answered, firing in short, disciplined bursts, but it was not their shooting that broke the line. It was the simple fact that he was there. The closest World Eater charged, bellowing, chain axe raised. The lion stepped into him, sword flickering in a tight arc that bisected haft and hand. The weapon spun away, teeth shrieking. In the same heartbeat, the Primarch's boot hammered into the warrior's chest, folding him, sending him crashing back into his own line. The impact disrupted the defensive stance more effectively than any artillery. The Dark Angels flowed into the gap. They did not shout, they did not chant. They advanced like a guillotine blade, each stroke of each sword placed with unerring precision. Traitor Marines fell, armor cracked at weak joints, visors punched in, throats opened where their gorgets had been neglected. Astartes of the Word-bearers and World Eaters alike discovered that all their fervor and past kills made little difference when confronted with a foe who saw them only as obstacles to be removed with maximum efficiency. In a matter of heartbeats, the doorway was theirs. Bodies lay wedged in the threshold, smoking where bolt rounds had cooked flesh inside plate, still twitching in some cases. The Dark Angels stepped over them without comment and drove into the inner sanctum. The chamber at the heart of the fortress was vast, carved out of the bedrock, and then expanded beyond what stone alone could allow. Its roof was lost somewhere above, lost behind coiling currents of warp light. Columns rose in mad spirals, their surfaces covered in scripture that crawled and shifted when looked at directly. In the center of the space yawned a pit. It was a simple shape, a circle cut into the floor, its edges lined with carved sigils and hammered iron rings. It might have been a well once, though no water had ever occupied it. Now it was a mass grave. Bodies filled it to a depth that could not be measured from the lip. They had been thrown in without care, stripped of any identity they might once have had, a human tide frozen in collapse. Here and there, limbs protruded, hands reaching skyward in permanent, silent supplication. The air above it shimmered with the heat of slow, unnatural decay. Vapors rose, curling up toward the unseen ceiling, then looping back down to condense on the slick stone. At the far side of that obscene altar, a tall figure in crimson armor stood with his arms raised. The Dark Apostle's plate was more ornate even than that of his earlier brethren. Great parchments hung from his shoulders, covered in lines of text small as the writing in a legal codex. Chains looped from his waist, carrying icons fashioned from fused bone and brass. His helm was a snarling thing, shaped like a stylized skull, its eye lenses burning a hateful violet. At his side waited a champion of the World Eaters, bulked in reinforced plate adorned with brass studs and broken chains, an axe in his hands that seemed almost too large for even Astartes to wield. Around them, ringed along the pit's edge and at intervals throughout the chamber, stood the remnants of the inner circle. Word-bearers with faces painted in ritual designs, eyes lit by madness, World Eaters breathing heavily, weapons chattering as their hands twitched. Behind them, lesser figures knelt or lay prostrate, mortal cult servants and broken auxiliar remnants drawn here for this final rite. The Dark Apostle's voice rolled out as the lion's boots touched the sanctum floor. "Ah," he said, drawing the word out. "The hunter arrives at last. You are late, Johnson. The offering is already made. You come only to kick at the bones." He gestured expansively with his staff, indicating the pit. Warp light played along the corroded metal of its head, flickering with each syllable. "You know how many souls lie here?" he went on. "Of course you do not. You do not count that way. You tally only in tactical advantages and disadvantages. But across this world, across your dear Ultramar, we have written a number that would make even your father blink. Entire generations poured into the furnace. We have made a choir for the gods from their final cries." The World Eater beside him spat blood and laughed. "Better still," the champion growled, his voice rough as gravel. "Your own have joined them. Your auxilia, your serfs, your precious compliant citizens. They died just the same, screaming just the same, feeding the same glorious fire. Does that gnaw at you, Lion? Does it trouble your sums, knowing that your ledger of acceptable losses looks so much like ours?" The name they spoke next was thrown like a blade. "Kurz is not here to see it," the Apostle said, "but he would have loved this chamber. We have learned much from him, you know. The joy of spectacle, the artistry of fear. We thank you for turning him loose. Without your failure in your own heart, brother, much of this would not have been possible." "And Luther," the World Eater added, savoring the syllables as if they were some rare delicacy. "What would he make of this, do you think? Your faithful warden, your loyal shadow. Does he still pray for you, out there in the dark? Or has he learned new devotions by now? Perhaps he kneels before an altar just like this one, even as we speak." They wanted a reaction. They craved it. It was as much part of their ritual as any sacrifice. The lion did not answer. He walked. His retinue spread slightly, shields lifting, weapons ready, but they did not surge ahead of him. The Primarch advanced alone toward the circle of traitor Astartes, sword held low, point trailing a faint line along the stone. Warp light danced around him, distorting his outline, but could not quite commit to touching. To many of the mortals present, he seemed unreal, a figure painted over the world. One word-bearer could not take the pressure. He opened fire, bolter chattering, rounds sinking into the rhythm of his labored breathing. The shells streaked toward the Primarch. The lion stepped sideways. The movement was small, almost lazy, but the effect was wrong. The angle his body took did not match the arc his footfall should have produced. For an instant, his cloak trailed a fraction behind the motion, as if reality itself had needed a heartbeat to catch up. The rounds passed through where he had been and detonated against the floor, ripping chunks from the stone. He was already in front of the gunman. The sword flickered. To those watching, it looked as if the word-bearer's helm simply separated from his shoulders. One frame, he was there, shouting, "Weapon up." The next, his head was tumbling backward, helmet and neck torn through in a cut so clean that for a moment there was no visible damage at all, only a thin, dark line that then erupted as the corpse toppled. The Astartes next to him tried to adjust his aim. The lion's offhand caught the bolter and pushed it aside with gentle force. The traitor's finger clenched reflexively. The burst took his own fellow in the chest. Before he could recover, the Primarch's elbow, moving in a tight arc, crumpled his visor and the skull beneath it. He fell without sound. It went on like that. No wasted swings, no flourish. Each motion followed naturally from the last, a chain of cause and effect without slack. It was like watching a calculation being resolved, numbers cancelling one another out, factors being reduced, until only the irreducible remained. The inner ring of bodyguards who had surrounded the pit died in heartbeats, their death so fast and precise that some of their comrades did not realize they were down until they found themselves alone. The World Eater champion roared and charged. He surged across the blood-slick stone like a cannon shot, axe raised high, every step leaving dents in the floor. His armor thrummed with the pulse of butcher's nails, biting deep into his thoughts. For him, there was nothing in that moment but target and weapon and the ecstatic promise of contact. The lion let him come. At the last instant, as the axe scythed down, the Primarch shifted his stance. The weapon's teeth scraped along the edge of his sword, shrieking as they failed to find purchase. The lion turned, letting the force of the swing slide past him, redirecting it. The champion stumbled, off balance. A boot hooked behind the traitor's leg. A twist of the lion's torso added momentum. The World Eater crashed to one knee, armor screeching in protest. The Primarch's blade dropped, point spearing into the space just behind the champion's kneecap. Ceramite split, bone and augmetic reinforcement cracking. The warrior screamed, the sound forced from him by pain even his butcher's nails could not quite drown. He tried to stand. His leg refused to obey. He swung his axe in a desperate horizontal sweep from the reduced height. Again, the lion moved in ways that felt slightly wrong. He seemed to be in two places in the same second, cloak lagging behind his body, edge of blade blurring. The axe went past, clipping only empty air. The Primarch's sword came up under the champion's extended arm, slicing through tendons and cables. The limb fell limp, the axe clattering from nerveless fingers. The World Eater knelt there, breathing in ragged, furious gulps, reduced yet unbroken. His helm turned, lenses fixing on the lion. "Kill me," he snarled. "Or do you mean to leave me here as a warning? Hang me on a wall? Make a lesson of me, knight?" "In a sense," the lion said. He turned away from the crippled Astartes, leaving him there, alive and furious, a living demonstration to the traitors still watching of how comprehensively rage could be undone by precision. The champion's attempts to drag himself forward, to reach his foe, only emphasized his impotence. The Dark Apostle, perhaps sensing his ally's reduced usefulness, chose that moment to adopt a different weapon. "Lion," he called, lowering his staff a fraction, taking on the semblance of a man ready to parley. "I would speak. You have earned that much. For all your arithmetic cruelty, you have always listened when reason was presented to you." The Primarch continued his advance, step by measured step. "Consider," the Apostle said, words coming faster as he felt his window closing. "Zepath is already ours. Its soul is written. Its people are broken. You can kill us. You can burn this fortress, but the work will remain in the warp. The mark has been made, or... He gestured toward the pit with the staff's head. You can stay your hand. Leave this world as it is. Permit its remaining population to embrace the faith they have already been forced to serve. In return, I will give you something you truly desire. He smiled behind his grill. I will call Kurz here, he said. I will speak his name in the places where the veil is thinnest and invite him to look upon what we have made. He will not refuse. He hungers for such spectacles. Imagine it, Johnson, the night haunter walking into your carefully laid snare, drawn by the promise of terror. You can have your justice, and we will keep our shrine, a bargain of sorts between honest monsters. The lion did not even slow. There is nothing you can offer me that I wish to possess, he said. The apostle's composure cracked. You would condemn this place for pride alone? He shouted. You speak of duty, of the Imperium, of order, and yet you throw away the chance to end the life of the brother who haunts you. Also, you can throw fire like a petulant child denied a toy. The lion reached the edge of the pit. He looked down into it, at the sea of bodies, at the way the mass of them had begun to shift in subtle ways, as if something moved beneath. Warp light guttered along the surfaces of exposed bone, tracing patterns laid down by word-bearer hands. Then he looked past it, at the machinery the traitors had built around the chamber. Warp engines, set into alcoves along the walls, throbbed with sick life. Chains and conduits ran between them, connecting to hanging cages and dripping altars. He reached out with one hand and gripped a thick support column. The dark apostle faltered. For the first time, something like doubt crept into his voice. "What are you?" Stone screamed. The pillar tore free of ceiling and floor, snapping like a rotted tree. Dust cascaded. The lion turned, dragging it with him as easily as a man might swing a staff. He drove its broken end through one of the warp engines, crushing metal and sorcerous glass alike. The impact detonated contained energies. A ripple of force rolled out, smashing lesser altars, sending cultists tumbling. Chains snapped. A cage containing a cluster of half-formed demonic shapes fell into the pit, its occupants squealing as they dissolved into the mass below. The lion let the ruined pillar fall, then moved on to the next point of support. His warriors moved with him, tearing at structural elements, hurling broken machines into sacrificial pits, kicking down rune-etched plinths. Word-bearers who tried to interpose themselves died quickly, their bodies flung aside, often into the very engines they had been trying to protect. The dark apostle screamed, staff raised, lashing out with bolts of warp force. One struck the lion squarely in the chest. For a moment, the Primarch's outline blurred, edges flickering, as if something were trying to rewrite him. Then the pressure broke, shards of ghostly light scattering harmlessly. The Emperor's genecraft, the lion's own iron will, and the lingering wards of the crusade all combined to deny the blow. He stepped up onto the lip of the pit and crossed the narrow span, sword rising. The apostle threw himself back, erecting a barrier of sorcerous energy. The lion's blade cut through it, as if it were morning mist. The staff parried once, twice, sparks shattering. On the third clash, the weapon snapped, its head spinning away. The fourth stroke took the word-bearer's arm at the elbow, sending it tumbling into the grave he had helped. Phil. The apostle staggered, Vox grill spitting static. "The gods see," he gasped. "They see what you do here. They will remember." "Yes," the lion said, "they will." He drove the point of his sword through the traitor's chest, pinning him to the stone. With a simple twist of his wrist, he angled the blow so that the body toppled backward, sliding down into the pit. The dark apostle's final convulsions sent ripples through the heap of dead. The ritual, already destabilized by the destruction of engines and pillars, screamed. The air tore. Minor demons burst from the seething vapors above the pit, shapes half-formed, their bodies more suggestion than reality. Ink-dark hounds, their jaws too wide, loped along the edge. Winged things that were part man and part shrieking bird flapped from alcove to alcove. Tendrils of malign thought coalesced into almost humanoid silhouettes, reaching for the warm minds in the chamber. The lion turned on them as if they were any other enemy. His sword cut. Where it passed, things that had never known steel shrieked and came apart, dissolving into greasy smoke that stank of cold ash. A hound leaped, jaws gaping, and found itself impaled through the throat, its body collapsing into a collapsing knot of unlight. A winged abomination swooped, claws reaching. The Primarch's free hand snapped up, fingers closing around its neck. He slammed it bodily into a warp engine casing, its substance splattering like filthy paint before evaporating. His retinue fought with him, bolters barking, chainswords grinding. Librarians called out wards, their force staves glowing as they struck at more stubborn manifestations. In the space of a dozen breaths, the demonic incursion was reduced to a few lingering eddies of unnatural darkness curling away into nothing. The chamber shuddered. Without the engines, without the pillars, without the guiding will of the Dark Apostle, the ritual could not sustain itself. The pit's surface convulsed, bodies rising and sinking, as if in some ghastly tide. Cracks spidered across the floor from the lip outward. Sections of ceiling began to drop in larger chunks. The lion did not pause. "Destroy everything," he said, voice carrying even over the rising roar. "Altars, tomes, icons. If you can lift it, break it. If you cannot lift it, bury it. We leave nothing here for archaeologists or scavengers to find." The dark angels obeyed. They moved through the collapsing sanctum with the same methodical intent they had brought to the slaughter. Shrines were toppled, statues smashed. Librarians seized the most dangerous grimoires, those bound in skin or wrapped in chains of symbols, and hurled them into fires kindled from broken banners and splintered pews. Warp engines, too large to be dragged into pits, had their control cores ripped out and shattered. Anything that looked as though it might once have been a relic was stamped underfoot until it became unrecognizable scrap. Years of word-bearer labor, the collected effort of countless sermons and sacrifices, were reduced to rubble and ash in the time it took the fortress to die. Some traitors attempted to surrender. A wounded World Eater, his armor cracked open, dropped his weapon, and raised empty hands. A word-bearer with a broken jaw fell to his knees, trying to speak through blood. Others simply lay where they had fallen, not daring to move, hoping that stillness might make them invisible. The lion's instructions on that point had been clear long before they set foot in this place. No prisoners, no debates, no theological contests. This was not a court, it was an execution. Wounded enemy Astartes who still clung to life were either shot where they lay or left in places where the collapsing structure would finish the work. One dark angel hauled a groaning traitor beneath a cracking archway, propped him there, and stepped back without a word. The next fall of stone did the rest. There would be no camps of repenting heretics on Zepath, no secret cells where word-bearers were interrogated for forbidden knowledge. The lion understood that those were just other kinds of altars. Here, the only acceptable ending was oblivion. When the inner circle lay dead, when the last of the demons had been slain or driven out, when the fires had taken most of what could burn, the lion stood in the center of the sanctum and looked around. The roof had partially collapsed. Great slabs of stone hung at crooked angles, supported by supports that had not yet given way. Warp light flickered in fitful bursts, like a dying lantern, casting the scene in shades of sickly color. Smoke coiled in the air, mixing with dust and the faint, fading glow of things that had once been powerful and were now only dangerous in a more mundane way. The Primarch's warriors had fallen back toward the terrace, withdrawing according to silent signal as the structure's stability deteriorated. They left their gene-sire alone with the dead by unspoken agreement. It was not for them to share whatever passed across his features in moments like this. He stood at the edge of the pit, sword point resting on the stone, breath steady. On the far wall, half obscured by soot and cracks, hung a mirror. It had been a decorative piece once, perhaps part of the fortress's original configuration, long before the word-bearers came. In the course of their alterations, they had left it there, scrawling scripture around its frame, using its surface to reflect the glow of their rites. Now its glass was fractured into a spider web of lines, smeared with blood and ash. The images it returned were broken and doubled, jagged fragments of reality thrown back in disjointed ways. Lionel Johnson looked into it. He saw himself in pieces. Here a shard that held his eyes, hard and pale. There a splinter showing the line of his jaw, set like stone. Another fragment caught the sweep of his blade, its edge still unstained by anything that could truly mark it. Across several smaller shards, the green of his armor was smeared with traitor blood and the soot of burning scripture. Behind him, reflected in other slivers, the pit yawned. The heap of corpses inside shifted slightly as the fortress groaned, a slow settling of too many bodies in too small a space. For a moment, the angle made it seem as though he stood not on the edge, but within it, another figure among the dead, another piece of meat stacked on the altar. He saw, too, in those jagged pieces, the echo of other scenes. Cities burned under his command for reasons that had seemed clear at the time. Worlds that had ceased to exist because the Imperium had no safe way to leave them alive. The Dreadwing's work. His work. The same calculus, applied over and over, arriving again and again at the same conclusion. Annihilation. The word-bearers had believed they served gods because those gods had given their cruelty meaning. The lion did not believe in their deities. He did not believe in any power that required such gestures. But as he stared at his own fragmented reflection, there was no denying that he shared one thing with the men he had just killed. He too had become very good at ending things. Stone cracked above him. He lifted his gaze from the mirror, turned without comment, and walked toward the exit as the sanctum finally began to come apart in earnest. Behind him, the mirror toppled, shattering utterly on the stone, reducing his divided reflection to dust and glitter. The pit swallowed more of its edge. Fires leaped higher as fresh air gusted in through new rents. By the time he reached his warriors on the terrace, the inner heart of the fortress had begun to collapse in on itself, a controlled ruin of his own making, burying altar and pit and corpse alike under tons of indiscriminate wreckage. Whatever he had seen in that shard of glass stayed with him. Whatever judgment he had passed on himself joined the long list of other decisions he did not have the luxury of revisiting. There was still a world to finish killing. In the administratum ledgers that survived the burning of Ultramar's outer worlds, Numentis appears as a model entry, capital of Zepath, population listed as 5 million. Productivity quotas met or exceeded across multiple cycles. Compliance rituals performed according to schedule. A neat line in tidy script, one of countless such lines that made up the illusion of a stable realm. In the records compiled after the Shadow Crusade, the same city appears again, under a different heading. Numentis, secured by elements of the First Legion and attached auxilia. No hostile forces remaining. No survivors located within city limits at time of pacification. No one left alive. By the time the Dark Angels had fought their way across the southern continent, broken the fortress that anchored the rituals, and driven the word-bearers, and world-eaters into whatever shallow graves they could find, Numentis had already died. It did not fall in the screaming, theatrical fashion of Anthilaster, with a tower of bone raised from its citizens. It died more quietly. Its 5 million souls had been harvested in a manner less ostentatious, but no less thorough. The city lay on a wide plateau, its tiers stepping down toward the plains in concentric arcs of habitations and civic structures. It had been designed according to Guilliman's principles, with traffic flows and administrative hubs laid out so that governance and industry could move efficiently. Now its transit lines were clogged with wrecks, its hab blocks blackened, its temples gutted. Fires still smoldered in the lower levels, choking the air with a bitter haze. Dark angels moved through its avenues in careful formations, bolters ready, autosenses scanning. They found bodies in the streets, in the plazas, in the collapsed transit hubs. Some had clearly died in hasty executions, lined up along walls and shot. Others lay where they had fallen during panicked flight. Many more were simply gone, their absence marked only by the residue of mass movement toward places that had since been converted to pits or engine chambers. Squads breached manor houses and administratum annexes, clearing room by room, expecting at any moment to find a pocket of cultists or a contingent of traitor marines that had somehow slipped the net. They found only silence and the lingering stink of incense corrupted by other, fouler scents. The Vox reports repeated the same phrase over and over. No contacts, area secure, no living humans detected. The word-bearers had built towers here as well, though not on the obscene scale of Antilasta's spire. They had taken existing civic centers and grown them upward with additions of metal and bone, wrapping them in script and wiring them into the warp engines that pulsed beneath the city. They stood like rotten teeth, crooked against the skyline, their once inspiring facades hidden behind layered sigils and hanging chains. Lionel Johnson made Numentis his stage. He could not undo what had been done to Zepath. The city's tally of dead was fixed. The best he could offer was that, in the centuries to come, it would not stand as a shrine to the gods that had feasted here. He would not give them that satisfaction. On the day the fortress finally ceased resisting, and the last points of organized traitor presence had been snuffed out, the Primarch stood on a balcony overlooking Numentis' central district. The word-bearer towers loomed on the horizon, their silhouettes jagged against a sky still scarred by smoke and the faint glow of distant fires. "Bring them down," he said. Engineers and Dreadwing specialists answered. Demolition charges were set at the bases of the corrupted towers, not with care to preserve the original structures beneath, but with the express intent of erasing them entirely. Grav haulers and tractor units dragged at their flanks while artillery pounded at their upper reaches. One by one, they toppled, crashing across surrounding blocks, crushing anything that might have remained of the original civic buildings under tons of debris. Where the word-bearers had dug mass graves, the Dark Angels ordered consolidation. The scattered pits and shallow burial trenches around Numentis were opened again, their contents combined into fewer, deeper vaults. Mortals would have balked at the work. Legion serfs did it with the numb efficiency of men who had seen too much already. The bones and flesh of loyal citizens and corrupted cultists alike were emptied into anonymous ossuaries carved into the bedrock, sealed with plain slabs of stone. No names, no inscriptions, no place a future believer could point to and say, "Here, this is where the martyrs of the old faith lie." If the living ever chose to raise their own monuments later, that would be their decision. For now, the Primarch's will was simple. Chaos would leave no lasting statues on this world. No one had survived in Numentis itself, but not all of Zepath's population had been folded into altars or pits. In the outlying settlements, far from the primary targets of the word-bearers and world-eaters, men had dug. Some had hidden in mine shafts, in fuel caverns, in half-forgotten maintenance tunnels. Others had fled into the marginal lands beyond the cities, clinging to life in caves or shattered farmsteads, living on whatever ration packs or stored grains had escaped the first sweeps. When the fortress fell and the word-bearer towers came down, those scattered remnants began to creep back toward the capital. At first they came in ragged bands, armed with rusted rifles and improvised blades, expecting to find the traitors still in control. They found instead the green-armored giants of the First Legion. War had cauterized their capacity for trust. Most of them approached with weapons in hand, eyes hollow. It took repeated efforts by the few auxiliar survivors attached to the Dark Angels to convince them not to die for the mistaken belief that the Astartes was simply another kind of monster sent to finish the purge. In time, convoys formed. Trucks without fuel were loaded with the very old and the very young, then towed by other vehicles whose engines had not yet seized. Men marched beside them, gaunt and dust-covered. They filed into Numentis in their tens of thousands, a pitiful fraction of the billions who had once called Zepath home. They looked at the Dark Angels with a fear that had very little to do with any specific threat. It was the fear of men who had seen gods walk in other shapes, and had learned that such beings did not come to them for reasons they would ever truly understand. The green giants might be protectors or executioners, or both. The distinction was academic. To the survivors, they were simply inhuman. On a broad avenue that had once borne parades and civic celebrations, Holgan stood with a cluster of officers and watched one of these convoys make its way toward a hastily established camp. The men shuffling past had the look of ghosts. Many were wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they had been able to find. Some had bandages that had not been changed in days. All of them flinched when their gazes brushed across the armored figures on the sidewalks. "They pray when they see us," one officer said quietly. "Some of them. Lips moving, hands shaking. They do not know which name to use, so they just pray to whatever will listen." Holgan's jaw tightened. "They should not," he said. "We are not gods." "No," the officer agreed. "They know that. They have seen gods. They have seen the gods of the word-bearers, and whatever passes for gods to the world-eaters. They know those things do not look like us." He paused, then added, "But they also know we are not men, not in any way that matches their lives. There is no word in their language for what we are, so they use the closest they have." Holgan watched a boy stumble, fall, then scramble back to his feet under the weight of a sack almost as big as his wasted frame. A Legion serf stepped forward without thinking and took the burden from him. The boy froze, eyes wide, then bolted, leaving the serf holding the sack as if it were some kind of accusation. "We are building Imperium Secundus out here," Holgan said, low enough that only his immediate companions could hear. "A realm that claims to be a refuge, a bulwark. But what will these people remember? That we came as saviors, or that we came as a storm that drowned their world and then moved on?" One of the other officers, older, armor scarred and patched, shrugged. "They will remember that we were the ones left when the traitors had finished," he said. "Perhaps that is all we can hope for." In a repurposed administratum hall, near the city's former center of governance, Lionel Johnson convened what passed for a council. The chamber's high ceiling was cracked, daylight leaking through in thin shafts. The grand mural that had once depicted Zepath's place in the wider pattern of Ultramar's domains lay in flakes on the floor, shattered by concussive force. The great table at the room's center had survived, though its surface bore scorches and gouges. Around it sat the men who had been chosen to speak for the survivors. A former planetary governor's adjutant, now the highest-ranking civil functionary still alive. A militia commander whose unit had been bled almost white in the first days and who had since taken scraps of authority where he could. A handful of local leaders, men who had kept pockets of humanity alive by hiding them or bartering with lesser traitor officers until the balance of power shifted. They looked small in the chairs that had once held confident governors and visiting dignitaries. They looked smaller still, under the gaze of the Primarch, standing at the head of the table. Holgan, Redloss, and a selection of other Dark Angels officers ringed the room, armor forming a wall of green and bone against the damaged walls. A single remembrancer, the same scribe who had seen the engine pens in the fortress, sat in a shadowed corner, scratching notes with a hand that shook only occasionally. "This world is yours," the lion said. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. The delegates glanced at one another, then back at him. "You will administer it as best you can," he went on. "You will bury your dead, rebuild what you are able, and ensure that whatever faith tried to take root here finds no purchase again. You will answer, in time, to whatever governance Ultramar re-establishes when the storm clears enough for its fleets to reach you in strength." The adjutant cleared his throat, voice thin. "My lord," he said, with respect. "Administer what? We have lost almost everything. Our crops, our manufactoria, our law enforcement, our—" He stopped himself before saying faith. "Everything," he finished instead. "We have a city of empty buildings and a few tens of thousands of broken men in the streets. And now you say it is ours?" "Yes," the lion said. "It is. It was never mine. It belonged to your people long before the word-bearers and world-eaters came, and it will belong to your people long after I have gone, if it endures. That is your task now, not mine." Another delegate, the militia commander, leaned forward, knuckles white on the table's edge. "Forgive me, Lord," he said, "but are you going?" The Primarch's gaze turned to him. It was like being pinned to a board. "Yes," he said. "My legion is not a garrison force. We have tarried here longer than we should already. There are other fires to put out, other worlds in worse peril than yours. And if the traitors come back," the man pressed, desperation sharpening his tone, "if they send another fleet, if some other warband decides that Zepath is a convenient altar, will you return? Will any of you?" Holgan stirred, stepping forward a half-pace. "Understand something," he said, voice cold. "We did not choose for this war to begin. We did not choose for your world to be dragged into it. Horus Lupercal chose that. His word-bearers and world-eaters chose that. If you must hate someone for what has happened here, hate them. When you curse the lack of protection in the years to come, curse the hand that broke the gate, not the men who arrived through the wreckage too late to save everything." "That is not an answer," the adjutant said, remarkably steady. Holgin's lip curled. "It is the only answer you are strong enough to hear," he said. "The war is not a local storm. It is a galaxy-wide burn. We cannot promise you defense every hour of every day. We cannot set a company of Astartes to watch every shrine and crossroad of every world that has bled. Ultramar will send aid in time. Guilliman will do what he can. We have cleared the immediate infection here. That is what we could do. Do not mistake us for the omnipotent saviors your former sermons promised. We do not wear that lie well." The militia commander subsided, jaw clenched. The other delegates exchanged looks that mingled resentment with grim acknowledgement. They had seen enough in the past span of days to know that promises of eternal safety would be meaningless anyway. The lion let the exchange play out without intervening. When he spoke again, his tone was as before, measured, final. "I will leave a garrison of mortal troops," he said. "Elements of your own auxilia that have proven themselves under fire, and those serfs of the First Legion who can be spared from my fleet. They will help you stabilize your infrastructure, maintain basic order, and relay messages when the warp allows. Beyond that, you will stand on your own feet as best you can." He leaned forward slightly. "You have seen what happens when men look to gods to save them," he said. "Do not make the same mistake with us. Build your strength in such a way that if someone comes to burn you again, you have at least some teeth to sink into their hands." The council ended on that note. There were no grand oaths, no ceremonial handovers. The Primarch left them to their maps and their tallies. their arguments over how to ration scarce food and where to billet the tide of broken humanity that had flowed into Numentis. He had spent enough time in that room for one lifetime. In the days that followed, the Dark Angels withdrew their main formations from the surface. Assault companies, armor elements, Dreadwing specialists, all were rotated back to their ships in stages, leaving behind only those units specifically designated for temporary garrison duty, the scars they had carved. Into Zepath's skin would take far longer to fade than their presence. The cost of the campaign, when some semblance of accounting could be attempted, made for ugly reading. Auxiliary regiments attached to the 1st Legion on Zepath were listed as near total losses. The few surviving officers who could sign their own names did so with hands that shook from exhaustion and lingering radiation sickness. The number of Dark Angels dead remained officially unrecorded, as was customary, but the gaps in company rosters told their own tale. Entire squads gone. Veteran sergeants whose names had appeared in dispatches for decades, now marked only by the silent space where they had once stood. Civilians were harder to count. Records from before the Shadow Crusade spoke of billions across the Zepath system. Many had died in the early phases, under Wordbearer and World Eater knives, in the belly of Phosphex fires, in the grip of warped engines that drank their pain. Many more had been caught in the eschaton that followed, burned or poisoned when the Dreadwing rewrote landscapes to choke off corruption. When the dust settled, the surviving population could be measured in the low millions, scattered across a system that had once held so much more. Hundreds of millions, likely billions, had been extinguished in the course of a single campaign, their existence reduced to a statistic that would sit in some archivist's scroll, filed under strategic consequences, Shadow Crusade, Outer Ultramar, and what had been gained: a traitor redoubt erased, a fortress broken, ritual sites shattered, a world prevented from sliding entirely into the Ruinstorm's maw, a beachhead denied to word-bearers and world eaters who would otherwise have used it as a staging point for further atrocities. To those who cared only for lines on star charts, it was a clear success. To those who walked through the empty streets of Numentis and counted the skulls in Antilasta's ruin, the victory tasted different. Confirmation that Kurz was not on Zepath came in the form of silence. No trace of his particular signature, no pattern to the killings that matched his obsession with message and response. No sightings by surviving civilians of a pale thing in ragged armor slipping through their nightmares made flesh. Intercepted vox logs from the fleeing word-bearers and world eaters spoke of other campaigns, other horrors, but did not mention the Night Haunter's presence. For the Lion, this meant only one thing. This entire nightmare had been a dead end in his hunt, a corpse on the road, not the killer. Perhaps a deliberate misdirection, perhaps simply another manifestation of the wide, senseless cruelty that had blossomed once the first Primarch turned his face from the Emperor's path. Either way, the result was the same. He stood once more in a strategium, this time aboard his flagship, watching Zepath turn slowly below. Its continents were scarred, great glassy strips marked where rad waves and phosphex floods had passed. Clouds trailed in strange patterns over the ruins of cities. Tiny sparks of new activity showed where men labored to clear roads, to restart generators, to plant whatever stunted crops the poisoned soil would still accept. If Kurz was ever here, he said, mostly to himself, he is laughing now. Holgen stood nearby, helm under his arm, scars on his face deeper than they had been before this war. He lifted one shoulder in the faintest of shrugs. "Let him laugh," he said. "He has less to laugh about than he thinks. His allies here are dead. His altars are broken. His gods have one fewer choir singing in this part of the warp." The Lion did not answer. His eyes were on the Ruinstorm's edge, where the madness coiled and churned, blotting out the stars. In the end, this is perhaps the clearest truth one can draw from Zepeth. The lion hated chaos. He hated the need it felt to make meaning from suffering, to stack bones in patterns that amused forces that would never understand the cost. He raged, in his quiet way, against the word-bearer's sermons and the world-eater's joy in slaughter. Yet when he looked upon a world like Zepeth and judged it beyond recall, he called down horrors that any impartial observer would find hard to distinguish from those inflicted by the traitors. Rad storms that would twist the bodies of any survivors for generations. Phosphex fires that clung to flesh and stone alike. The Dreadwing's eschaton imperative, which cared nothing for the distinction between guilty and innocent once invoked. In the age of the heresy, victory and atrocity walked side by side so closely that their shadows blended. It is easy, years later, to draw neat lines on maps and say, here the loyalists stood, and there the traitors fell. It is harder to stand in a place like Numentis, breathing air still thick with the ghosts of the dead, and say with certainty which fire was holier. When the last orders had been given, when the garrison lists were final, and the mortal commanders had been briefed to the point where more information would only drown them, the First Legion's fleet prepared to leave. From the surface, men looked up and saw the warships rise, their hulls turning slowly as they climbed. To the remnants in the streets, they were vast, unreachable things, their bellies lit with engine glare. Some wept as they watched them go, some cursed, some merely lay down where they were and slept, too empty to feel anything more. On the Invincible Reason's command deck, Lionel Johnson stood before the viewing ports and watched Zepeth recede, its wounded sphere diminished, becoming one more damaged world among many. It was not saved, not in any sense that would have satisfied the people who had once written its glowing administratum entries. But it lived. That was more than could be said for many others. He turned his eyes away from it and back to the crimson, storms ahead. "Plot the next vector," he said. "We follow the trail. Kurz is still out there." The hololiths shifted. New threads of possibility lit up in the murk of the ruin storm. Reports filtered in from other broken sectors, whispers of a pale monster on shattered moons, of massacres that bore the distinctive artistry of the Night Haunter's hand. Another world awaited. Another ledger of the dead would be opened and balanced in blood. The fleet moved, engines flaring, prows pointing into the mad light. Behind them, Zepeth turned on, a battered, poisoned, stubbornly living sphere. Ahead, the storm closed once more, swallowing the shapes of the ships as they drove deeper, their Primarch's tally of annihilated foes and ruined worlds growing with each new engagement. His own soul did not grow any cleaner for it.